Imagine for a moment that everything you were told about the first people of this continent was only the part that fit, the part that could be measured, the part that could be carbon dated and then quietly filed away. Imagine the rest of it, the rest that does not fit. The rest that sits there in the red dust and the dry caves and the painted walls and stares back at the people studying it. The way an old face stares back at a child who is asking the wrong question. There is a lot of that on this continent, more than most of us have ever been told, more than most of us would believe if we were told it in plain daylight, with our coffee going cold, in the middle of a normal afternoon. So instead, I am going to tell it to you now, quietly, while the lights are low, while the wind is moving somewhere outside the window, while the world is doing what it does at this hour, which is mostly sleeping. We will go slowly. We will not rush. We will look at the parts of Aboriginal history that the textbooks mention in one short paragraph, and then walk past, because to stop and look at them properly is to admit that the timeline does not behave the way a timeline should. We will look at footprints that should not exist. We will look at paintings of animals that died out before anyone was supposed to be holding a brush. We will look at stone walls built by people who were said not to build walls. We will look at maps drawn in song across thousands of kilometers by people who were said not to draw maps. And the more we look, the stranger it becomes. The deeper we go, the less sense it makes. So lie back, let the room get a little softer around you, let your breathing slow. There is nothing here that needs to be solved tonight. There is only a long, quiet walk through a much older country than the one we were taught about in school. Before we go any further, I want to invite you to do one small thing. If you find the rhythm of this voice useful for sleep, or if you find these stories about the older layers of this continent interesting, please subscribe to the channel and tap the little bell next to the subscribe button. That tap tells the platform to bring you the next quiet documentary the moment it is uploaded, usually late in the evening, usually when you're looking for exactly this kind of thing. You do not need to do anything else. You do not need to comment. You do not need to share. Just subscribe, tap the bell, and let the rest of the night unfold. The channel exists because people like you choose to come back. And every time you come back, another long, slow story like this one becomes possible. Thank you. Now close your eyes if you would like. We are about to begin. The list we are about to walk through is not arranged from least strange to strangest, because that would require an agreement about what counts as strange, and on this continent that agreement does not exist. Instead, we will move the way a person moves through an unfamiliar landscape after dark, slowly, with the torch held low, pausing whenever something at the edge of the light asks us to pause. There are 22 of these pauses tonight, 22 places or objects or stories or fragments that do not behave the way the official timeline says they should. Some of them are world famous, some of them you may never have heard of. A few of them, I suspect, will stay with you long after the morning comes. You do not have to remember them. You do not have to write anything down. You are not being tested. The point of tonight is not to learn. The point of tonight is to wonder, and then eventually to sleep. So let us begin where most of the official histories begin, even though the official histories never quite know what to do with what they find there. Number 1, Majid Bebe, the shelter where the calendar broke. Majid Bebe is a rock shelter in northern Australia, tucked into the sandstone country of Arnhem Land, a few hours' drive from Jabiru if you are coming from the south. A long quiet drive through escarpment and floodplain, and the kind of green that only exists in the wet tropics in the months after the rains. You would walk past the entrance if you did not know what it was. It looks like 1,000 other shelters in that country. A long overhang of weathered rock, a sandy floor, a few etchings on the wall that could be 10 years old or 10,000, depending on which etching you happen to be standing in front of. Inside that shelter, in the late 1980s and again in the 1990s and again in 2015, archaeologists began to dig. They dug down through layers of dust and ash and stone and shell. The way archaeologists dig everywhere, slowly, with brushes, with patience, sifting each handful through fine mesh. And as they dug, they found things: stone tools, grinding stones, ground edge axes, ochre, mica, pigments, charcoal, bones, the kind of debris that builds up under a roof when people have been sheltering there for a very long time. And then the dating came back, and the dating did not behave. The lowest layers, the layers with the ground edge axes and the grinding stones, came back at around 65,000 years before the present. 65,000, read that number again, 65,000 years. The official timeline, the one that lived in textbooks for most of the 20th century, had people arriving in Australia around 40,000 years ago, maybe 45,000 if you were feeling generous. Majed Bebi pushed that back by 20,000 years in a single excavation report. 20,000 years is not a rounding error. 20,000 years is longer than the entire history of agriculture. 20,000 years is longer than the entire history of cities. 20,000 years is the gap between the building of Stonehenge and the present day, doubled and then some. And the tools at the bottom of that shelter were not crude. The ground edge axes are among the oldest examples of that technology anywhere on Earth. The grinding stones suggest plant processing. The pigments suggest art or ritual or both. Whoever was living in that shelter 65,000 years ago was not a desperate straggler who had just stumbled out of the sea. They were a person with a kit, with a routine, with a way of doing things that had clearly been done many times before. And the question that hangs over that shelter, the question that nobody on either side of the academic argument quite knows how to answer, is this: if the bottom layer is 65,000 years old and the tools in that layer are already mature, where did the people learn to make them? Not in Majid Bebe. The shelter is not old enough for that. They learned somewhere else. Somewhere we have not found, somewhere that is either still under the sand, or still under the sea, or still under a layer of red dust that nobody has thought to dig through. The shelter at Majid Bebi is not the beginning of the story. It is the middle of the story. And we do not have the first half. Number 2, Lake Mungo, the man who was buried with ceremony in a world that was supposed to be too young for ceremony. Lake Mungo is not really a lake anymore. It is a dry bed in the far west of New South Wales, surrounded by long, pale dunes that the locals call the Walls of China. The wind there moves the sand, constantly lifting it from one ridge, dropping it onto another, exposing in the morning what was hidden the night before. In 1968, a geologist walking those dunes noticed a small white shape in the sand. He bent down. He brushed at it. It was bone, burned bone, human bone. The remains turned out to belong to a young woman, and the way she had been laid to rest was extraordinary. She had been cremated. Her bones had been broken after the cremation, possibly to allow them to be placed in a smaller bundle. She had been buried with care, and the date that came back from her remains was somewhere around 42,000 years before the present, with later analysis pushing it as far as 45,000. She's called Mungo Lady. 5 years later, in 1974, another set of remains was found nearby. A man this time, tall, lean, buried on his back with his hands crossed in his lap, his body covered in red ochre that had been carried to that site from a quarry over 200 kilometers away. He is called Mungo Man, and his burial is one of the oldest ceremonial burials known anywhere on this planet, older than the pyramids by tens of thousands of years, older than agriculture by tens of thousands of years, older than the painted caves of Lascaux, older than almost anything you can name. And here is what does not fit. The textbook story of human ritual behavior, the story we have been told for most of the last century, is that ritual burial appears late in the human record, that it is a sign of complex symbolic thought, of religion, of a sense of the sacred, and that this kind of behavior developed in the Near East and in Europe and then spread outward. But Mungo Man does not know about that story. Mungo Man was laid in the earth with his hands folded and his body painted red on a continent that the textbook said had not even been settled yet at the moment he was being mourned. Mungo Man is a problem. He is a polite, quiet, ochre-stained problem. And he has been a problem ever since the sand exposed him. The community whose country he came from took him home eventually. He was returned to Mungo in 2017, after decades in storage at the Australian National University. He rests now at last in his own country, but the questions he raises do not rest. The world he was buried into had to have produced him, had to have raised him, had to have taught his mourners how to grieve him. That world is older than the timeline allows, by a lot. Number 3, the Gwion figures, the paintings nobody knows how to explain. In the Kimberley, in the far northwest of the continent, there is a style of rock art that does not look like the other rock art on the continent. The figures are tall and thin. They wear long tasseled garments and elaborate headdresses. They carry boomerangs and dilly bags. They appear in many cases to be in motion, mid-stride, mid-dance, mid-procession. Their proportions are elegant. Their lines are confident. They were painted, it appears, in a kind of dark red mulberry pigment that is bonded so completely with the rock that no chemist has yet succeeded in dating it directly. They are called the Gwion by the local people, and they were called by another name in the older European literature, a name we will set aside tonight because the people of that country prefer the older name. There are tens of thousands of these figures, painted across hundreds of sites, scattered across an area larger than some countries, and nobody knows how old they are. The estimates range from 12,000 years to more than 40,000. A study using mud wasp nests built over some of the figures returned an age of 17,000 years for those nests, meaning the painting underneath them had to be at least that old. Another study suggested some panels might be twice that age. The Kimberley elders say that the figures were painted by birds, that a small bird called the Gwion pecked at the rock until its beak bled, and the blood became the pigment and the image. Western science has tended to smile politely at that story and then walk past it. But the story is more interesting than the smile suggests, because no matter who painted them or how, the figures themselves do not look like the people who were said to be living in that country at the time they were painted. They look like a different people, a people with formal dress, a people with ceremony. a people whose images do not appear in this developed form anywhere else on the continent. The Gwion paintings are, in a real and uncomfortable sense, an unsigned letter from a vanished population. We do not know who they were. We do not know where they went. We do not know what their language sounded like or what their songs were about, or whether the long, thin figures in the paintings are self-portraits or portraits of someone they remembered or portraits of someone they hoped to become. They left no village we have found. They left no graves we can match to them. They left no descendants who have stepped forward and said, yes, those were our ancestors. They left only the paintings, and the paintings do not say. Number 4, the Wandjina, the faces with no mouths. Also in the Kimberley, in some of the same gorges and overhangs where the Gwion figures dance their long, quiet dance, there is another style of painting entirely. The Wandjina, the cloud and rain spirits of the local peoples, painted enormous, sometimes life-sized, sometimes larger than life. Their faces are white, their eyes are huge and dark, set inside concentric rings. They have no mouths. Around their heads they wear what looks, to a modern eye, unmistakably like a halo or a helmet or both. The lines radiating from their heads have been interpreted in many ways, as lightning, as rays of light, as feathers, as the strands of long hair, as something else. The Wandjina paintings are sacred to the Warora, the Ngarinyin, and the Wunumbal peoples, and they have been retouched and refreshed by the custodians of those sites for generations. Because in the local understanding, a Wandjina that fades is a Wandjina that must be brought back gently with the right hand and the right intention and the right words. So the paintings on the rock today are not necessarily the paintings of a single moment. They are the visible surface of a tradition that has been kept alive by careful repainting across an enormous span of time. The first Europeans to see the Wandjina paintings in the 1830s and again in the early 20th century found them so striking, so unlike anything in the surrounding art, that they invented entire theories to explain them away. The figures were said to be Phoenicians, Egyptians, visitors from elsewhere. None of those theories were ever taken seriously by the local people, who have always known exactly what the figures are. They are the Wandjina. They came from the sky and the sea. They made the country and the laws and the rain and the children. They are not strangers. They are ancestors. They have no mouths because if they had mouths, the local stories say, they would speak the world into a different shape. And the world, for now, has the shape they have chosen. What does not fit, what cannot be explained away with polite theories or with comparisons to other art traditions, is the visual signature of the Wandjina themselves. The halo, the huge dark eyes, the missing mouth, the white face, the long radiating crown. You will find figures that look uncannily like the Wandjina in the rock art of cultures that never met the people who painted them. You will find similar figures in the deserts of the Southern American continent. You will find similar figures in the highlands of Central Asia. You will find similar figures in the prehistoric art of the Mediterranean. The official explanation is convergence, different peoples in different places arriving by chance at the same visual conclusion. The unofficial wandering, the wandering that happens late at night in front of a low fire, is that the Wandjina were not invented in the Kimberley. They were remembered there, and remembered elsewhere too, by people who had no way of telling each other what they remembered, which would mean that something at some point was seen by all of them. The local stories do not flinch from this possibility. The local stories simply nod and continue. Number 5, Budge Bim. the stone village that was not supposed to exist. For most of the 20th century, the textbook description of Aboriginal life on this continent was a single word, repeated in different forms across thousands of pages: nomadic. The textbook said that the first peoples of Australia were nomadic hunter-gatherers who walked the land in small family groups, who built no permanent structures, who farmed nothing, who fished with simple lines, who left no architecture behind because they did not build any architecture. That description, calmly repeated for generations, was wrong in a way that the textbook never quite recovered from. In southwest Victoria, on the country of the Gunditjmara people, there is a landscape of black basalt that was thrown out of a volcano about 37,000 years ago. The volcano is called Buj Bim now, and the eruption is remembered in Gunditjmara oral history, which makes that story one of the oldest verifiable oral histories in the world. After the lava cooled, the Gunditjmara did something remarkable with it. They turned it into a system, a network of channels, weirs, holding ponds, and stone-walled traps, stretching across about 100 square kilometers of country, designed to manage the seasonal movements of short-finned eels. The eels would migrate up from the sea each year. The stone system would catch them at the right moment, hold them in pools at the right depth, allow the smaller ones to pass, and harvest the larger ones in numbers that supported a settled population. And next to the stone system, the Gunditjmara built houses, round, stone-walled houses with central hearths, the foundations of which are still visible in the basalt today. Not temporary, not for a season. Built into the landscape with thick walls, sometimes laid in 2 rows with smaller stones packed between them. The kind of construction that takes time and that lasts. The radiocarbon dating on the eel traps comes back at around 6,600 years before the present, and possibly older for the earliest channels, which would make Buj Bim one of the oldest aquaculture systems anywhere on Earth. Older than the rice terraces of Asia, older than the irrigation channels of the Middle East, older than almost any farming system you can name. And the Gunditjmara did not build it for one generation. They maintained it, modified it, extended it for thousands of years. The houses around the system suggest a settled population of hundreds of people, possibly more during the peak of the eel run. So when the textbook said the first peoples of this continent did not build, did not farm, did not stay in one place, the textbook was looking the wrong way. The textbook was looking past the basalt. The basalt was right there. The houses were right there. The traps were right there. The eels themselves are still right there, still migrating, still passing through stone channels that were laid before the first stone of any pyramid was lifted into place. Buj Bim does not fit the nomadic story. Buj Bim breaks it. Quietly, with basalt. Number 6, Brewarina. The fish trap's older than memory. There is a river in western New South Wales called the Barwon, and it runs through a town called Brewarina. And in the bed of the river, where the water shallows over a long reach of rock, there is a series of stone structures that look, at first glance, like the natural arrangement of boulders that you would expect in any river. They are not natural. They are not random. They are a fish trap, the largest, and by some counts the oldest, fish trap on the planet. The Brewarina fish traps, called Bayamese Ngunhu by the local Ngemba people, consist of a network of low stone walls laid out across the river in interlocking curves and pens. The pens are designed to use the current of the river to herd fish into shallow pools, where they can be caught by hand or with nets in numbers that can feed hundreds of people. The traps were built, according to the local story, by Bayame himself, the creator figure, who threw his net across the river and showed the people how to set the stones. According to the geologists and archaeologists who have studied the site, the traps were built by human hands, but the date at which they were first laid is harder to pin down than almost any other date in this story. Some estimates put the first construction at around 40,000 years before the present. Others are more cautious and offer 10,000. Either way, the traps are old. They are old enough that they predate most of the agricultural revolutions in other parts of the world. They are old enough that the people who built them were doing something the textbook said the first peoples of this continent did not do. They were engineering a river. They were modifying their environment at scale. They were doing it together, in numbers, with a shared plan. And they were doing it on a country that the official story said had no permanent occupation, no large gatherings, no infrastructure. The Brew Arena traps are infrastructure. They are the kind of project that requires a population large enough to imagine it, organized enough to build it, and stable enough to maintain it across centuries. And they have been maintained. The pens have been rebuilt many times. Floods have moved the stones. Floods have been allowed to move the stones. New stones have been placed. The traps have changed shape over the millennia, the way any living infrastructure changes shape. They are still there. You can stand on the bank of the Barwon and look down at them. You can walk among them when the water is low. You can hear the river move through them, and you can hear, if you listen for it, the faint clattering of fish in the shallow pens. It does not sound like an empty country. It does not sound like a country with no history. It sounds like a country that has been busy, deeply busy, for far longer than the school book said it had. Number 7, the songlines, the map that nobody could draw. There is a way of moving across this continent that exists nowhere else on Earth. And that is harder to describe than almost anything else in this story, because the thing being described is not an object. It is not a stone. It is not a painting. It is not a structure. It is a network of roots, sung rather than drawn, carried in memory rather than printed on paper, passed from one generation to the next through song, dance, ceremony, and the careful placement of one foot in front of another, along a path that is no path at all to an outsider, but that is to the person walking it, the equivalent of a marked road with named exits. The songlines, as they are usually called in English, cross the entire continent. They cross deserts, mountain ranges, rivers, coastlines. They cross the territories of dozens of different language groups, and at each border, the song is handed off to the next custodian, who sings the next section in their own language with their own variations, but with the same waypoints, the same sequence, the same map. A single songline can stretch for thousands of kilometers. A traveler following one of these songs can find water in country they have never visited, can find food in seasons they have never experienced, can find shelter from weather they have not yet felt, because the song knows. The song knows where the spring is. The song knows where the cave is. The song knows where the tree grows that holds the fruit you are looking for. And the song has known these things, in some cases, for tens of thousands of years. What does not fit, what makes the official story stretch and crack at the edges, is the implication of the songlines for the population that created them. To build a network of sung paths across an entire continent, you need a population that is in continuous contact with itself. You need messengers. You need shared ceremonies. You need annual or seasonal gatherings at which the songs are checked, refreshed, agreed upon. You need a level of communication and coordination that the textbook description of small scattered nomadic bands cannot account for. The songlines imply a much more integrated population than the official story allows. They imply meetings, they imply diplomacy, they imply trade, they imply a shared cultural project on a continental scale, maintained for a length of time that beggars belief. And the songlines are not theoretical. They are still walked, they are still sung, the people who know them still pass them on, where the chain has not been broken. In some places, the chain was broken in the 19th century, and the song was lost, and a route that had been known for 40,000 years closed in a single generation. In other places, the chain is intact and the song is still being handed off at the same borders, in the same way to the same purpose. The world is older than we are told, and it is more connected than we are told. And the proof, if you want to call it that, is being sung tonight somewhere out there in the dark by someone whose ancestors were singing the same notes when the last ice age was still in full retreat. Number 8, the stories that remembered the sea. There is a category of Aboriginal oral history that is not supposed to exist because the events it describes are too old for any human memory to have preserved. And yet the stories are there, recorded, compared, cross-referenced. And they say, with a precision that no folklore should be able to manage, what the coastline of this continent looked like at the end of the last ice age. The basic facts are these. About 20,000 years ago, at the height of the last glacial maximum, the seas around Australia were much lower than they are now, as much as 120 meters lower in some places. The continental shelf was exposed. The land that is now underwater around the coast of Australia was, at that time, dry. People lived on it, they hunted on it, they camped on it. They named the rivers and the hills and the islands that stood above what was then a much wider continent. Then the ice melted, the seas rose, slowly at first, then in surges. The coast moved inland by tens, in some places hundreds, of kilometers. The land that had been inhabited disappeared under salt water. The hills became islands, the islands became reefs, the reefs eventually became invisible. And the people retreated generation after generation to the new coast, the higher coast, the coast that we know today. That part of the story is geology. It is in the sediment cores, it is in the dated shorelines, it is not disputed. What is disputed, or what was disputed until quite recently, is whether anybody could possibly remember it happening. Memory, the textbook said, does not work like that. Oral tradition fades, stories drift. After 1,000 years, the original event is unrecognizable. After 10,000, it's gone. And yet, there are stories along the coast of Australia that describe the sea rising. There are stories that name the land that was lost. There are stories in some cases that describe specific islands as having once been hills connected to the mainland. There is a story from the Yidinji people on the North Queensland coast that describes a time when a person could walk out to what is now Fitzroy Island, when the channel between it and the mainland did not exist. There is a story from southwest Victoria that names a string of islands as having once been the country of a particular ancestor before the sea came. There are dozens of these stories. They have been collected in some cases by people who had no idea what they were being told. And when the stories are compared against the geological record of post-glacial sea level rise, they line up, they name the right places, they describe the right changes, they preserve, in the patterned form of a story, an event that ended at least 7,000 years ago and that may have begun 15,000 years before that, which means oral tradition can hold a fact for at least 7,000 years, possibly twice that, possibly longer. The textbook said that was impossible. The stories say it is not. And the sea, which used to be much further out than it is now, says nothing. It just keeps lapping at the same shore, year after year, century after century, in a country that remembers what it used to look like. Number 9, the animals that should not be in the paintings. Across the rock galleries of the north and the center of this continent, there are paintings of animals that no living person has ever seen. Animals that died out, according to the fossil record, between 40,000 and 20,000 years ago, depending on the species and the region. Megafauna, the big ones, the marsupial lions, the giant kangaroos, the long-beaked echidnas the size of sheep, the diprotodons, which were rhinoceros-sized marsupials with broad, flat skulls and gentle vegetarian eyes, and the thylacine, the so-called Tasmanian tiger, which survived on the Australian mainland until perhaps 3,000 years ago, and on the island of Tasmania until the 1930s. The thylacine in particular is painted everywhere, in styles ranging from very old to very recent, which makes sense because people who painted it would have seen it. But the others, the diprotodons, the marsupial lions, the bigger creatures, they are painted too, not often, not everywhere, but they are there. There is a painting in the Kimberley that has been interpreted as showing a marsupial lion with the right body shape, the right tail, the right pouncing posture. There are images in Arnhem Land that have been interpreted as showing diprotodons, drawn at a scale that suggests the painter knew how large they were because the painter had seen one. There is a famous gallery in northern Australia that has been described by careful and conservative archaeologists as containing the silhouette of a Genyornis, which was a flightless bird the size of a small ostrich, and which is supposed to have died out around 45,000 years ago. The painting of the Genyornis, if it is indeed a Genyornis, would have to be at least that old, possibly older. And here is what does not fit. If those paintings are what they appear to be, they were made by people who saw the animals while the animals were still alive, which means people were on this continent painting on its walls with sufficient artistic skill to record an accurate likeness, at a time that the textbook said either had not yet happened or was happening at the very edge of human presence here. There is, of course, a counter-argument. The animals in the paintings might be stylized, they might be composite, they might be from stories rather than from life, they might be deliberate exaggerations or deliberate hybrids. The argument is fair. The argument is also incomplete, because the people who painted them, even if they were painting from story rather than from life, still got the proportions right. They got the postures right, they got the tail lengths right, they got the details that you cannot get from imagination alone. Somebody at some point saw a marsupial lion close enough to remember how it moved, and that memory was preserved in paint on a rock wall for a length of time that strains every assumption we hold about how long any image can last. 40,000 years is a very long time to keep painting the same shape. But the paintings are there, the animals are not. and whoever first painted them was looking at something that nobody alive today has ever seen. Number 10. The footprints at Willandra, the chase that nobody followed. Back near Lake Mungo, in the dry lakebed country of the Willandra system, the wind kept doing what the wind does there, which is to lift the sand and expose what is underneath it. In 2003, a young woman from the local Muti Muti community noticed something in a freshly exposed clay pan. Small impressions, regular, sequential, footprints, she told her elders. The elders told the archaeologists. The archaeologists came out very carefully with brushes and string and grids, and what they uncovered was a sequence of human footprints preserved in a hardened layer of clay that had been laid down somewhere between 19 and 23,000 years ago. The footprints were fresh in a sense. The clay had set quickly after a particular weather event, and the prints had been protected by overlying sediment ever since. When the wind exposed them, they looked the way footprints look on a beach a few hours after they are made. Crisp, clean toe pads, heel strikes. The pressure ridges where the foot rolled forward, 23,000 years old. There are dozens of these prints. Some of them are children, some of them are adults, some of them are walking, several of them are running, and one of them is the longest single trackway of running prints found anywhere in the world. A man, the analysts said, tall, possibly very tall, somewhere around 2 meters in height, running at what would today be considered a competitive sprint. The stride length suggests a speed close to that of a modern professional sprinter. The footprints are deep, indicating that he was pushing hard off the ground. He was running across a wet clay flat, possibly hunting, possibly chasing something, possibly being chased himself. And then the trackway ends, or rather, the trackway disappears under the unexposed part of the clay pan, and nobody has uncovered the rest of it. We do not know what he was running towards. We do not know what he was running from. We do not know if he caught it. We do not know if it caught him. We know only that 23,000 years ago, on a wet day in the middle of what is now a very dry country, a very fast man ran very hard across a clay flat, and his footprints were preserved, and the wind eventually uncovered them, and a young woman from the country where he ran noticed them, and the people who study such things came and looked at them, and the prints were dated, and they are real. The official story said this country was sparsely populated at the time, that the climate was harsh, that people were just hanging on. The prints say otherwise. The prints say that 23,000 years ago, the country was full enough of people that some of them could afford to sprint. They were not desperate. They were not starving. They were busy. They had things to chase. And they were chasing them on a wet morning in a country that has since dried out and pale grass and silence, but that on that day, in that hour, was alive with the sound of running. Number 11, the sky map, the astronomy that should not be there. In the early 2000s, a small team of researchers began to ask a question that nobody had thought to ask before. What did the first peoples of this continent know about the night sky? Not the popular question, which is what stories they told about the sky. The deeper question, what did they know about the sky as an observed object? What patterns had they noticed? What predictions had they made? What measurements had they recorded? The answer turned out to be far more than anyone expected. The Burong people of northwestern Victoria, before their culture was disrupted in the colonial period, kept a star calendar that tracked the appearance and disappearance of specific stars in the sky against the seasonal availability of specific foods. They knew when to expect the malleefowl to lay eggs because of the position of a particular star. They knew when to expect a particular plant to fruit because of the position of another. The star Arcturus, which they called Marpian Cook, was the herald of the wood ant larvae season. The Pleiades, which they called Larnankuk, marked the cold months. The Southern Cross was a possum. The dark cloud beside the Southern Cross was an emu. And the position of the emu in the sky, head down, neck stretched, told the people when emus on the ground would be laying eggs, because the position of the celestial emu mirrored the behavior of the terrestrial one. The sky was a clock and a calendar, and a hunting guide and a mythology, all at once. And this was not unique to the Burong. Similar systems have been documented among the Yolngu of Arnhem Land, the Watermen of the Northern Territory, the Adnyamathanha of the Flinders Ranges, the Yuwalai of northwestern New South Wales. Each people had their own constellations. Each people had their own star calendar. And in some cases, the constellations are not constellations as the Western tradition would recognize them. They are not patterns of bright stars connected by imaginary lines. They are patterns of dark clouds traced in the negative spaces between the stars against the bright background of the Milky Way. The emu in the sky is a dark cloud emu. The kangaroo is a dark cloud kangaroo. To see these constellations, you do not connect the bright dots. You look at the shapes of the darkness between them. This is a different kind of astronomy. It is older in some respects than the astronomy of any other tradition we know about, because it does not require advanced optics or written records. It requires only the sky and a memory and a willingness to look at the spaces between things. There are stone arrangements on this continent, including one at Wodayuwang in Victoria, that appear to be aligned to the setting positions of the sun at the equinoxes and the solstices, in a way that resembles the alignments of certain monuments in Europe and in the Americas. The Wodayuwang arrangement has been dated to at least 200 years before the present, but possibly to thousands of years before that. If the older estimate is correct, it would predate Stonehenge by a wide margin and would suggest that the people who built it were tracking the sun with the precision necessary to mark 4 seasonal turning points in the year. Astronomy of that kind requires generations of observation. It requires the passing of information from teacher to student in a structured way. It requires a society that values knowledge of the sky enough to keep building stone arrangements to record it. None of that fits the textbook story of nomadic bands wandering across a continent in search of the next meal. The astronomy says these people were not just surviving, they were watching. They were watching closely. They were watching for a very long time. Number 12. The crater that stayed in the song. There is an impact crater in Central Australia called Hembury, and another called Wolf Creek, and another smaller scatter at a place called Tunurala in the Northern Territory. The Hembury craters are a cluster of small holes in the ground, formed when a meteorite broke apart in the atmosphere, and the fragments struck the Earth at high speed. The Wolf Creek crater is larger and more famous, a near-perfect circular bowl visible from the air, about 300,000 years old by some estimates and possibly older. Tinurala in the West MacDonnell Ranges is a giant ring of red rock walls in the middle of a flat plain, the eroded remains of a much older impact, dated to around 142 million years ago. The first 2 craters have something extraordinary attached to them. They have stories. The local Arrernte people of Central Australia tell a story about Tunarala that describes a baby being carried in a wooden coolamon, a curved bowl that mothers use to carry infants and food. The coolamon, the story says, fell from the sky during a dance in the heavens. It struck the ground and made the ring. The dancers continue to dance in the sky above, and the baby is still there, somewhere in the center. The Hembury craters have a story too. The local Luricha people called the area Chindu Chinawaru Chingiyabu, which translates roughly as the place where the fire devil ran. They forbade their people to drink water from the craters because the fire devil might come back and burn them. They also forbade them to camp there because the place had been struck by something from the sky and the something might return. The European scientists who studied the Hembury craters in the 1930s found that the stories matched what the geology said had happened. A meteorite had broken apart and the fragments had struck the ground. The fragments had been hot enough to melt the surrounding rock. The fire devil had indeed run. The stories also got the recency right. The Hembury impact is estimated to have occurred about 4,700 years ago. The local people had preserved, in story form, the memory of an event that the geological record confirms happened almost 5,000 years ago in their country on their watch. That is not a coincidence. That is observation passed down. The implication is that oral tradition on this continent has, in at least some cases, preserved direct eyewitness accounts of events from a time when the rest of the world had not yet invented writing. The implication is that the people who carried those stories were paying attention. The implication is that the sky was being watched and that when something fell out of it, the watchers remembered. 4,700 years is not a small distance. The pyramids of Giza were being built around the same time. Stonehenge was being completed. The first cities of Mesopotamia were finding their feet. And on a continent that the textbook said was empty of complex society, somebody saw a meteor strike and told their children, who told their children, who told their children, until the story reached the white scientists who came out with their compasses and their notebooks and confirmed that yes, in fact, the sky had fallen here, and somebody had been here to see it. Number 13. The Cuddy Springs Problem, the site that refused to be young. In western New South Wales, on the country of the Gamilaroi and Yuwalarai peoples, there is a dry clay pan called Cuddy Springs that is only really a spring in the wettest of seasons. And for most of the year, it is a flat circle of cracked grey clay surrounded by saltbush and dust. Underneath that clay pan, in layers laid down between 30,000 and 40,000 years ago, archaeologists have found something that should not be there. Stone tools, grinding stones, charcoal from human fires, and right alongside them in the same layers, the bones of megafauna, the big ones. The Diprotodon optatum, the largest marsupial that ever lived. The Genyornis newtoni, the giant flightless bird mentioned earlier. The Procoptodon goliah, the giant short-faced kangaroo, which stood almost 3 meters tall. The bones and the tools were found together in the same sediment, in the same horizon, by careful excavation in conditions that the archaeologists who worked the site described as unambiguous. And the dates returned by the laboratory said that humans and megafauna had been in the same place at the same time, around the same fires, for thousands of years. This is a problem. The official story of the Australian megafauna extinction is that it happened quickly, within a few thousand years of human arrival, and that humans were the primary cause through hunting, through fire stick farming, through habitat alteration. The story is sometimes called the Blitzkrieg model, after the German word for lightning war, because the killing was supposed to have been fast and total. Cuddy Springs does not support that story. Cuddy Springs suggests that humans and megafauna coexisted in that part of the continent for at least 10,000 years, possibly longer, sharing the same water hole, using the same landscape, with the humans occasionally butchering the megafauna and eating them, but not driving them to extinction. The other camp of archaeologists, the one that prefers the Blitzkrieg model, has argued that the Cuddy Springs dating is wrong. They have argued that the sediment has been disturbed, that the layers have been mixed by water action, that the tools and the bones only look like they are in the same horizon because the horizons have been smudged by groundwater and tree roots. The archaeologists who worked Cuddy Springs disagree point by point, layer by layer. The argument has now run for more than 30 years and shows no sign of resolving. What is not in dispute is that the site itself is extraordinary. Whether the dating holds or not, the simple fact that the question is even possible to ask is something. There is a place in this country where humans and giant kangaroos and rhinoceros-sized marsupials may have shared a waterhole for 10,000 years. The textbook would prefer to say that human and giant kangaroo did not share much. They met. There was a brief, terrible exchange. The giant kangaroo lost. End of story. Cuddy Springs is not a brief exchange. Cuddy Springs is, if its dating holds, a very long, quiet coexistence, broken occasionally by hunger, but mostly characterized by mutual avoidance and shared access to water, which would mean that the megafauna of this continent did not end in a blitzkrieg. They ended in a slow attrition, possibly more from climate than from hunting, possibly because the water holes dried up faster than the giants could adapt. The humans in this version of the story were not the executioner, they were the witnesses. They watched, they butchered when they could, they moved on when the water holes dried, and they remembered in the form of stories about big creatures that used to live in the country, stories that some elders are still telling today, about animals that nobody alive has seen, but that the old stories say were here, drinking from the same springs as the ancestors until they were not. Number 14. The hairy people of the bush. There is a category of being in Aboriginal oral tradition that does not appear in any field guide, that has never been photographed, that has never been collected as a specimen, and that the official story says does not exist. The hairy people, the wild folk, the ones who live in the deep bush, in the gorges, on the ridges, away from the camps. They go by many names: the Yowie in much of the east, the Junjidi in North Queensland, the Changara among some of the desert peoples, the Quinkin in parts of Cape York, though the Quinkin is sometimes described as a different kind of being entirely. The stories about them are remarkably consistent across language groups that have had little contact with each other. They are tall, they are covered in dark hair, they smell strong, they move quietly, they do not normally attack people. They sometimes take food, they sometimes take children in some of the older versions. They are afraid of fire. They are seen most often at dusk or at dawn or after a long period of solitude in the bush. And the people who tell the stories are not, by and large, telling them as fairy tales. They are telling them as practical advice. If you are going into that gorge, take a brand from the fire. If you are camping near that ridge, do not leave the children alone. If you smell something rank in the bush and you have not seen a wallaby carcass nearby, walk the other way. The European response to these stories has, predictably, been to dismiss them, to classify them as folklore, to compare them to other hairy hominid stories from other cultures, the Yeti in the Himalayas, the Sasquatch in North America, the Orang Pendek in Sumatra, and to declare them all to be the same psychological projection, the wild self, the shadow, the thing in the woods that every culture seems to invent. And there is something to that comparison. The hairy people do indeed appear in stories from many parts of the world. They might indeed be a kind of universal shadow figure that every long settled human culture eventually produces. But the comparison cuts the other way too. If every culture that has lived in close contact with deep forest has produced stories of the hairy people, perhaps the question is not why all these unrelated cultures invent the same figure. Perhaps the question is what all these cultures have all noticed. The fossil record on this continent does not preserve hominid remains other than modern humans, as far as anyone has yet found. But the fossil record is incomplete. There are large parts of this continent where no systematic fossil search has ever been conducted. There are caves that have never been entered. There are stretches of dense forest in North Queensland where biologists are still finding new species of frog. The official story is that the Aboriginal people were the first humans on this continent. The unofficial wondering is that perhaps they were the first, but perhaps they were not the only. The stories about the hairy people are not framed in most cases as stories about ghosts or spirits. They are framed as stories about another kind of person, a person you might meet on a bad day in a place where you should not have been alone. The local elders sometimes laugh when they tell the stories, the way a person laughs at a thing they half believe and half do not. And sometimes they do not laugh at all. Sometimes they say only that there are places you do not go, and that if you ask why, you will not get a useful answer, but the place will tell you itself if you ever stand in the wrong part of it. Number 15. The pyramid that nobody can decide about. In southern Queensland, just outside the town of Gympie, there is a hill that has, for the past century and a half, been the subject of one of the strangest archaeological controversies in this country. The hill is roughly conical, its sides are terraced. The terraces are made of stacked stone in some places and earth packed against retaining walls in others. There are reports, going back to the 1860s, of farmers ploughing the surrounding paddocks and turning up artifacts that did not belong to the local Aboriginal tradition. Small statues, stone tablets with marks on them that resembled writing, though not any writing anyone could read, tools of a kind that nobody could place. Some of these reports were probably exaggerated. Some of the artifacts that were collected have since been lost. Some of them have been examined and dismissed as natural rock formations or as European objects misidentified. But the hill itself is harder to dismiss. The terraces are real. They are visible in old photographs. They were measured by surveyors in the 1930s. They were described in some sources as resembling the terraces of stepped pyramids found in other parts of the world. The official position on the Gympie Pyramid is that it is a misidentification, that the terraces are natural geological features, that the artifacts found nearby are either modern intrusions or misinterpreted local stones, that there is no pre-Aboriginal civilization on this continent, and that the hill is simply a hill. The unofficial position, held by a small but persistent group of researchers and local enthusiasts, is that the hill is the eroded remains of a structure built by someone at some point who was not part of the standard story of this continent. There have been theories involving early Egyptians, early Phoenicians, early Chinese, early Tamils, and visitors from elsewhere. Most of these theories do not survive close inspection. Most of them rely on coincidences of shape or on misreadings of artifacts. But the hill itself, sitting quietly in its paddock, does not entirely behave like a natural hill. The terraces are too even in places. The retaining walls, where they have been exposed by erosion, are too neatly built. The local Aboriginal tradition does not claim the hill as one of theirs. They have their own stories about the area, but the hill is not one of them. In the 1970s, parts of the original site were leveled for housing development. Whatever was there is now mostly under suburban driveways and lawns. A few sections remain, fenced off, on private property. They have not been excavated by professional archaeologists. They probably never will be, because the consensus position is that there is nothing there to excavate. But the hill is still there, the terraces are still visible, the question is still being asked, and the country, as it tends to do, is staying quiet. It is not offering its opinion. It is leaving the question to be argued by the people who think they know what hills should look like. And the people who think hills sometimes look exactly like that for a reason that nobody alive has the right tools to investigate. Number 16, the microblade revolution, the technology that arrived out of nowhere. About 5,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries, something happened in the stone tool tradition of this continent that nobody has yet succeeded in fully explaining. Up until that point, the stone tools of the Australian record were of a kind that had been used with steady refinement for tens of thousands of years. Flake tools, core tools, ground edge axes, grinding stones, tools that any archaeologist could recognize and that had clear lines of development running back through the previous 20 or 30,000 years of occupation. Then, around 5,000 years ago, a new kind of tool started appearing across large parts of the continent. Microblades, tiny, finely worked stone blades, often less than 2 centimeters long, struck from prepared cores using a technique that requires considerable skill to perform reliably. The microblades were used as the cutting edges of composite tools, mounted in wooden handles with resin and sinew. The way modern utility knife blades are mounted in plastic handles, they are dramatically more efficient than the larger stone tools they partly replaced. They take less raw material to produce. They can be made faster. They can be replaced more easily when they dull. They represent, in functional terms, a significant upgrade. And they appeared across the continent in many different regions in what appears to have been a relatively short window of time. This is the part that does not fit. Technological change usually moves slowly across large populations. A new tool gets invented in one place. It spreads gradually through trade and migration, an example, taking centuries or millennia to reach the far corners of the area where it will eventually be used. The microblade tradition seems to have spread faster than that. Some archaeologists have suggested that it was introduced by a new wave of migration, perhaps a small group of people who arrived from elsewhere with the technology already in their kit. Others have suggested that it was developed locally and then spread quickly along the trade and ceremonial networks that already crossed the continent. There is some genetic evidence that suggests a minor demographic event around the same time. There is some linguistic evidence that suggests a new language family began to spread across large parts of the continent around the same time. The connections between these strands are debated. The official story acknowledges that the microblade revolution happened. It acknowledges that the timing is interesting. It declines in most cases to commit to a single explanation. The unofficial wondering is that something arrived in this country about 5,000 years ago. Either a new people or a new idea or both, and that whatever arrived found a continent that was already populated, already organized, already in possession of long established cultural traditions, and that it folded itself into those traditions in a way that did not displace the existing population, but did change the tools they used. The dingo arrived around the same time, give or take a few centuries. The dingo, the genetic evidence shows, came from somewhere to the north, probably from the islands of the Indonesian archipelago. The microblade tradition and the dingo may have arrived together in the same boats with the same people, or they may have arrived separately by coincidence in the same general window. We do not know. We may never know. But the kit of this continent changed about 5,000 years ago in a way that has no fully satisfying explanation. Something came across the water. Something came with new ideas. The old population kept their songs and their stories and their countries, but their cutting edges got sharper, and the world they cut with them was not quite the same world afterwards. Number 17. The boomerangs that traveled too far. Most people, when they hear the word boomerang, think of two things at once. They think of a curved piece of wood that comes back when you throw it, and they think of Australia. The boomerang is, in the popular imagination, the most Australian object that exists. It is on the souvenirs, it is on the airline livery, it is in the postcards, it is part of the national brand. And the popular imagination in this case is not entirely wrong. The boomerang is indeed deeply Australian. It was used here in many varieties by many peoples for at least 10,000 years and possibly far longer. There are returning boomerangs used for sport and for driving birds into nets. There are non-returning hunting boomerangs, which are larger and heavier and which are thrown straight at prey rather than thrown in a curve. There are ceremonial boomerangs used for clapping in song and dance. There are fighting boomerangs used as close-range weapons. Each region of the continent has its own designs. Each design has its own purpose. The Aboriginal mastery of the boomerang as a class of tool is unmatched anywhere else on Earth. And yet, the boomerang is not only Australian. Curved throwing sticks of similar design have been found in archaeological contexts in northern Africa, in Central Europe, in the Americas, and even in ancient Egyptian tombs. There is a boomerang in the British Museum that was found in the tomb of the boy King Tutankhamun, who was buried around 3,300 years ago. The Egyptian boomerang is not identical to the Australian one. It is shorter, it is differently weighted. It was used, the Egyptologists say, for hunting birds in the reed marshes of the Nile Delta, but its shape, its principle of operation, and its purpose are the same. There are similar objects in the archaeological record of Poland, where a wooden throwing stick made of mammoth tusk was found in a cave called Oblazowa, dated to around 23,000 years before the present. There are similar objects in the indigenous traditions of the Hopi people of the American Southwest, who used a curved throwing stick called a rabbit stick. There are similar objects in the older record of the African continent, where curved throwing sticks were used for hunting hares and small game. The boomerang, in other words, is not unique to Australia. It is unique to nowhere. It is one of those objects that has been independently invented or possibly inherited by widely separated human populations over a very long period of time. And the question that hangs over the boomerang is the same question that hangs over many of the items in this list. Was it independently invented again and again by people who had no contact with each other, or was it inherited from some much older source that we have lost? The answer that most archaeologists would give is the first one: convergent invention. Different peoples in different places, all of them needing a way to throw something at a bird. All of them eventually discovering that a slightly curved stick of the right weight will fly further and straighter than a straight one. The mathematics of aerodynamics is the same everywhere. The shape that works is the shape that works. The answer that the unofficial wanderers would give is the second one: that the boomerang is older than the spread of modern humans out of Africa, that its shape was carried in the kits of the first long-range migrants to every continent they reached, that when we find a boomerang in Tutankhamun's tomb and a boomerang in a cave in Poland and a boomerang in a creek bed in Queensland, we are not seeing convergent invention. We are seeing a single very old tradition, dispersed and locally adapted, preserved in scattered fragments. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Some of the resemblances are likely independent. Some of them may be inherited. The point is that the boomerang, the most Australian of objects, is not as exclusively Australian as the postcard suggests. It belongs in some sense to everyone, or to no one, or to a much older world that we have all forgotten that we are quietly still living in fragments of. Number 18, the two waves, the genetic ghost in the population. In the early 2000s, when the techniques for analyzing ancient and modern human DNA became sophisticated enough to extract real signal from the noise, researchers began to do something that had not previously been possible. They began to look in detail at the genetic history of the Aboriginal Australian population, with the consent and collaboration of the relevant communities, to ask questions about origins, migrations, and relationships to other populations elsewhere in the world. What they found was, in the broad outline, consistent with what the archaeological story had been suggesting for decades. Aboriginal Australians are descended from a population that left Africa, moved through southern Asia, and arrived on this continent at least 50,000 years ago and probably earlier. They are one of the most genetically distinct populations on the planet, having been largely isolated from other human populations for tens of thousands of years before the colonial period. But within that broad outline, the data revealed some surprises. One of them was a faint but reproducible signal of a second genetic contribution to the modern Aboriginal Australian population, not from Europeans, not from the recent colonial period, from much earlier than that. Around 4,000 years ago, give or take 1,000, a small genetic input appears in the data. It is most visible in some northern Australian populations. It appears to be related to populations from southern India and from parts of the Indonesian archipelago. It is not large. It does not represent a wholesale replacement. It looks like the genetic footprint of a small group of people, perhaps a few hundred individuals or fewer, who arrived from the north, contributed their genes to the existing population and were absorbed. This was striking news. Until that point, the standard story had been that there was a single founding migration to Australia, and then nothing, until the Makasan tripang fishers from Sulawesi started visiting the northern coast in the 17th century, and then the British in the 18th. The genetic signal said no. The genetic signal said that someone came across the water about 4,000 years ago, met the people who were already here, and stayed long enough to leave a trace. This is roughly the same time you may notice that the microblade revolution was happening, and roughly the same time that the dingo arrived. 3 lines of evidence, all pointing to a small migration event from somewhere to the north, around 4 to 5,000 years ago. The genetic data, the technological data, and the zoological data, all telling the same story from 3 different angles. The official position is that the evidence is real, but the event itself was small. A handful of people, a few canoes, a drift voyage possibly, a return trip possibly not. Their genes mixed in, their tools spread, their dogs ran off into the bush and became the dingoes, and the population that they joined absorbed them so completely that they left no separate trace in language, in story, in archaeology, only in these 3 small signals that the modern techniques have managed to pick up. The unofficial wondering is that the event was less small than the official version says. That the kit upgrade, the dog, the genetic input are too coordinated to be the result of a handful of drifters. That something more organized happened, a migration perhaps, a planned voyage, a people who came, lived, and were absorbed, leaving their genes and their tools and their companion animal behind, but losing their name and their language to the great silence that the deep past tends to impose on everything that does not write itself down. We do not know who they were. We do not know what they called themselves. We know only that some of their descendants are now walking around in northern Australia, carrying a small piece of southern Asia in their blood, and that the dingoes that follow them along the dirt roads at dusk are the great-great-great-great-grandchildren of the dogs that came with them 4,000 years ago. Number 19. The mahogany ship and the question of who came first. There is a story along the southwest coast of Victoria that has been circulating since the 1830s, when the first European settlers in that area began to compare notes about something strange that some of them had seen. The story concerned a wreck, a large wooden ship, partly buried in the sand dunes between Warrnambool and Port Fairy, on a stretch of coast that is now called the Shipwreck Coast. The wreck was not English. The settlers who reported seeing it described its timbers as dark, possibly mahogany or some other tropical hardwood, and the construction as being unlike any English ship of the period. They reported seeing parts of the hull. They reported seeing what appeared to be carved decoration. Some of them reported finding loose objects in the surrounding dunes, including weapons of a kind that they could not identify. The reports continued through the 1840s, 1850s, and into the 1860s. Then, somewhere around the 1880s, the wreck disappeared. The dunes shifted, the sand moved. Whatever had been there was either buried more deeply, or had collapsed entirely, or had washed back out into the sea. By the time anybody thought to look for it properly with the tools of 20th century archaeology, there was nothing left to find. Survey after survey has been carried out along that coast. Aerial photography, ground-penetrating radar, subsurface acoustic profiling, diving expeditions, nothing has been definitively found. The mahogany ship, as it came to be called, is a wreck remembered but not located. And the question it raises, the question it has always raised, is who built it and how it got there. The most popular theory is that the ship was Portuguese. There is evidence of a kind that has never quite reached the level of proof that Portuguese navigators reached the coast of Australia in the first half of the 1500s, more than 200 years before James Cook charted the east coast in 1770. The evidence includes a set of old maps, the so-called Dieppe maps, which were drawn in the mid-1500s in northern France, and which appear to show a large landmass to the south of Java that includes some recognizable features of the Australian coast. The Dieppe maps name the landmass Java la Grande, the Great Java, and the coastline they show, while distorted, includes details that look surprisingly like the southeast coast of Australia. If the Portuguese did indeed reach this coast in the 1500s, then a Portuguese caravel wrecked on the Victorian coast would not be impossible. It would be unprecedented in the official story. It would push back the European arrival on this continent by more than 2 centuries. And it would suggest that the Aboriginal peoples of the South Coast had some experience with European visitors long before the colonial period. There are other theories. Some suggest the wreck was Spanish. Some suggest it was Dutch, washed off course from the recorded Dutch landings on the west coast. Some suggest it was Chinese, from one of the great treasure fleets that may or may not have ventured further south than the official Chinese record acknowledges. Some suggest it was none of these, but rather the wreck of a much older voyage, perhaps from the Indian Ocean trading network of the early medieval period, or perhaps from somewhere we have not yet identified. The local Aboriginal traditions of that coast do contain some stories about strangers arriving from the sea long before the white men came. The stories are sparse, they are often dismissed as later additions, blurred together with memories of the early colonial period, but they are there. And the wreck, for the length of time it was visible in the dunes, was there too. We do not have it now. We may never have it again. The mahogany ship may be one of those objects that the country swallowed back into itself once it had been seen by enough people to enter the record, and that will not be regurgitated until the country decides we are ready to look at it properly. Whether that decision ever comes is not for us to know. The question, however, remains, and the southwest coast of Victoria keeps its silence the way coasts on this continent tend to do, while the sand shifts above whatever it shifts above. Number 20. The lost languages. The silence that fell across the country in a single century. Before the colonial period, this continent was, by the most careful counts available, home to somewhere between 250 and 300 distinct languages. Not dialects, not variants. Full languages, mutually unintelligible, with their own grammars, their own vocabularies, their own writing systems where writing existed, and their own song forms where it did not. Some of these languages were spoken by a few thousand people. Some were spoken by a few hundred. Some were spoken by only a handful of people, each in extremely localized pockets, often associated with a particular country and its particular ceremonies. By the end of the 20th century, of those original 250 to 300 languages, only about 13 were still being spoken as a first language by children. The rest were either extinct or in the process of becoming extinct. A few have been brought back painstakingly by the descendants of the last speakers working from old recordings and old field notes. But the work is slow and the gaps are large. The loss happened fast. faster than any comparable language extinction event in human history, with the possible exception of the Americas after the European arrival there. Within the space of about 150 years, perhaps 240 distinct languages, each one carrying its own way of thinking about the world, its own categories, its own poetry, its own technical vocabulary for the local plants and animals and weather, vanished from the daily life of the country they had been spoken in for tens of thousands of years. That is the surface fact, and it is bad enough on its own. The deeper fact, the one that does not fit the official story, is what those languages were like before the loss. Some of them were extraordinary. The Yolngu languages of northeast Arnhem Land have a system of kinship terms so complex that anthropologists have spent careers mapping it and still disagree about the details. The Pama-Nyungan language family, which covers about 80% of the continent, has a unity of grammatical structure across that enormous area that no other language family on Earth approaches. It is as if you went to Europe and discovered that Welsh and Greek and Estonian and Portuguese were all close cousins, with shared grammar, shared core vocabulary, and shared sound systems, despite being spread across thousands of kilometers of geographically and culturally divided territory. The Pama-Nyungan family does that, but across a continent and across tens of thousands of years. There has never been a fully convincing explanation for how a single language family came to dominate so much of this country. Some linguists have proposed that it spread along with the microblade revolution and the dingo around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, displacing or absorbing the older language families that had been here before. Others have argued that the family is older than that, possibly much older. The non-Pama-Nyungan languages, which survive in the north of the continent, are markedly different. They are more diverse from each other than the entire Pama-Nyungan family is internally. They are, by all appearances, the much older layer. They sound, to a comparative linguist, like the remains of what was here before something newer rolled across the rest of the country. What the something was, we do not know. What language the original inhabitants of this continent spoke when they first arrived, 50 or 60 or 65,000 years ago, we do not know. What proportion of the old languages survived into the colonial period in a form that allowed them to be recorded before they were lost? We do not know. We have fragments. We have word lists collected by amateur ethnographers in the 19th century, often spelled badly and translated worse. We have recordings made in the 1960s and 70s of the last fluent speakers of languages, whose populations had been reduced to 2 or 3 elderly people. We have the languages that are still alive in the central deserts and the far north and in pockets elsewhere, doing the work of keeping the country named in the words that have always named it. And we have the silence of the rest, the silence of the languages that were spoken on this coast and that one in this valley and that range in this particular pocket of country and no other, and that are now not spoken anywhere by anyone because the last person who knew them died in the 1940s or the 1960s or the 1980s without anyone to pass them on to. The country still remembers. The places still have their names in those silenced languages, even if there is no one left to speak the names aloud. The names are still there, written in the shape of the hills and the rivers and the way the wind moves through certain valleys at certain times of the year. The country has not forgotten. We have. And the gap between the country's memory and our knowledge of it is one of the largest and quietest mysteries of this whole strange long story. Number 21. Corandurk. the town that worked until it was not allowed to. About 60 kilometers east of Melbourne, on a curve of the Yarra River, there is a quiet stretch of farmland and bush that does not look, today, like the site of one of the most remarkable experiments in this country's history. There is a small cemetery, there are some old foundations, there is a reserve run by the descendants of the original community that holds the surviving knowledge of what once happened on this land. What once happened was Coranderrk. In the 1860s, a group of Aboriginal people from the Woi Wurrung, Taungurung, Bunwurrung, Wathaurong, and Jodja Wurrung peoples, having been displaced from their traditional country by the rush of European settlement, were given a piece of land at Coranderrk by the colonial government, which at the time was looking for somewhere convenient to put them. The land was marginal. It was not the country any of these people came from. It was 40 hectares of mixed bush and cleared paddock on the edge of land that white farmers had already decided was not worth taking. The colonial expectation was that the Aboriginal residents would farm a little, depend on government rations, and slowly die out, which was the standard expectation of the period, and which was articulated in writing in many official documents that we still possess. The Aboriginal residents had other plans. Within a decade, they had transformed Coranderrk into a working agricultural settlement that was producing wheat, hops, vegetables, and dairy products at quantities sufficient to feed itself and to sell surplus to surrounding towns. They built houses, they built a school, they built a church, they built a community hall, they organized a council with elected representatives from the different language groups that met regularly to make decisions about the running of the settlement. They sent petitions to the colonial government in clear written English requesting better tools, better seed stock, better access to medical care. They won prizes at the local agricultural shows for the quality of their produce. They were, by every reasonable measure, a successful self-governing community, demonstrating in plain sight that the assumptions of the colonial system about Aboriginal capability and Aboriginal future were entirely wrong. The colonial system responded by closing the settlement, not all at once, not openly, but over a period of about 30 years through a series of administrative decisions that progressively reduced the land available to Coranderrk, that progressively restricted the autonomy of its council, that progressively moved its residents to other reserves under the so-called Aborigines Protection Act, and that eventually emptied the place of almost all its original population. By the early 20th century, what had been a thriving community of several hundred people was reduced to a handful of elderly residents, and the land that they had cleared and farmed had reverted in large part to grazing leases held by white farmers. The Coranderrk story is not, strictly speaking, ancient history. It happened in the lifetimes of people whose grandchildren are still alive. The petitions are in the archives. The newspaper coverage is preserved. The arguments made by the Coranderrk Council in their own voices, in their own words, were preserved by their own descendants who keep the story going today. But the deeper question that Coranderrk raises is the same question that runs through every entry on this list. The official story of Aboriginal Australia, the one that says these were people incapable of complex social organisation, incapable of agriculture, incapable of self-government, incapable of adapting to changed circumstances, is not the story that the Coranderrk people lived. They did all of those things against enormous resistance in a single generation, on marginal land they had been dumped on by a government that did not expect them to survive. They survived, they thrived, they built, and when they had built enough that the official story could no longer hide them, the official story arranged to take their land away and disperse them so that the official story could keep being told, which is, when you think about it for a moment, a confession. The official story did not need to act against Coranderrk if the official story was true. The official story acted against Coranderrk precisely because Coranderrk was proving the official story wrong. And so the question becomes how many other Coranderrks there were across this continent in the deeper past before there was any written record to preserve them. How many self-governing settlements existed and ended without colonial intervention to end them, simply through the slow turn of time? How many achievements of the long Aboriginal history of this country were quietly erased by the same logic that erased Coranderrk? Repeated over centuries, repeated over millennia, repeated until the only thing left was a story about people who had supposedly never done anything, when in fact they had been doing things for longer than any other continuous human population on Earth. The hills of Coranderrk are quiet now. The original orchards are mostly gone. A few of the original buildings remain in various states of preservation. The descendants of the original community come back periodically to visit the cemetery and to talk to the country. The country listens. The country has always listened. The country, however, does not forget. And what it remembers about Coranderrk is a story that, if it were told properly, would change the shape of the whole national imagination. The story is still there, waiting to be told. Number 22. Murujuga, the largest gallery on Earth. On the northwest coast of the continent, on a peninsula of red iron rock that juts out into the Indian Ocean, there is a place called Murujuga. The colonial name for it is the Buru Peninsula. The peninsula is unprepossessing at first sight. It is dry, it is hot. It is covered almost entirely in tumbled red boulders, the color of old blood, weathered into rounded shapes by millions of years of sun and salt wind. To walk across it in the middle of the day is to walk across an oven. To walk across it at dawn or dusk when the rocks are cooling or warming is to see the surface of the place change color, from rust to pink to violet, to a deep black red as the shadows lengthen. And on every flat surface of every boulder, on every cliff face, on every shelf of weathered rock, there are engravings, petroglyphs, images pecked or scratched or ground into the rock by human hands. The estimates of how many engravings there are on Murujuga vary wildly. The lowest serious estimates put the number at around 500,000. The highest serious estimates put it at over 1 million. Murujuga is, by any honest accounting, the largest collection of rock art in a single concentrated location anywhere on Earth. There are more images on Murujuga than there are in any museum. There are more images on Murujuga than in any other rock art province that has been mapped. There are more images on Murujuga than anyone, including the local custodians, has ever fully counted. And the images are extraordinary in their range. There are animals, kangaroos, emus, fish, turtles, whales, sharks, crabs, birds of dozens of species. There are humans, single figures, groups, dancers, hunters, family scenes. There are spirit beings. There are abstract patterns, spirals, concentric circles, mazes, grids. There are images that researchers do not have names for. And there are, embedded in the larger collection, some figures that have caused real surprise. There is, for example, an engraving that has been interpreted by some researchers as showing a thylacine, which would not be remarkable in itself since thylacines lived on the mainland until perhaps 3,000 years ago. But the engraving in question is on a part of the peninsula where the surrounding images have been dated by careful comparative methods to a period much older than that. There are images that have been interpreted as showing the now extinct fat-tailed kangaroo, the Macropus ferragus. There are images, possibly, of the Tasmanian devil, which also vanished from the mainland thousands of years ago. There are images of animals that researchers cannot yet identify, that may be species that science does not know about, or that may be stylized versions of known species, or that may be entirely symbolic. The estimates of the age range of the Murujuga gallery vary from a few hundred years to as much as 40,000 years for the oldest images. Some of the petroglyphs are clearly recent. They are sharp. The patina has not yet returned to the cut surface. Others are clearly old. The patina has fully redarkened, and the engraving is only visible because the lines are slightly more weathered, slightly more rounded than the surrounding rock. Murujuga, in other words, is not a single artwork. It is a record, a long, slow, layered record of human engagement with that piece of coast, made by countless hands over what may be tens of thousands of years. The local custodians, the Yaburara, the Madudhunera, the Ngarluma, the Yinjibandi, the Wongutu'u, hold the knowledge of what the engravings mean. They hold the songs that go with them. They hold the protocols for visiting them. Much of that knowledge was lost in the 19th century, when the Yaburara people in particular were nearly entirely wiped out in a series of massacres committed by pearling industry settlers between 1868 and 1870. The survivors and the related peoples of the surrounding country have preserved what they could, but what was lost is not coming back. The engravings are still there. They will be there for a long time if nothing happens to them. But the gas processing facilities of the modern industrial era have been built on the peninsula too, and the emissions from those facilities have begun in recent decades to accelerate the chemical weathering of the rock. The patina is changing. The engravings in some places are fading faster than they have at any previous point in their history. Whether the gallery survives the next century in any form recognizable as itself is now an open question. Whether anyone will be able to read it, if it does survive, is another. The custodians are doing what they can. The country, as always, is keeping its quiet. And the largest open-air art collection on the planet, the record of a deep human presence on a coast that the official story said was barely populated, sits in the sun and waits to see what we will do. Number 23. The stone arrangements that nobody talks about. Scattered across the continent in places that you would not normally visit unless you knew to go and look. There are stone arrangements that are not graves, not shelters, not fish traps, not house foundations. They are something else. Lines of stones, circles of stones, spirals, crosses, patterns that take up acres of ground made of stones the size of footballs or basketballs, placed deliberately in arrangements that have clearly been maintained over long periods of time. There are stone arrangements in North Queensland that form long parallel lines stretching for hundreds of meters across open country. There are arrangements in Central Australia that take the shape of nested circles, sometimes 7 or 8 rings deep, with passages between the rings that lead, in some cases, to a central feature. There are arrangements in Western New South Wales that incorporate astronomical alignments, with stones placed to mark the rising and setting positions of specific stars and the sun at specific times of the year. There are arrangements in Victoria that have been described as resembling the megalithic monuments of Europe, though the resemblance is loose and the dating is uncertain. The Wurdi Yowang arrangement we mentioned earlier is one of the better known of these sites, but it is not unique. There are dozens of others. Some of them are sacred and not to be discussed in detail without the permission of the custodians. Some of them are no longer attached to any living tradition, and we have no idea what they were for. What is striking to a person walking among them is how much labor went into their construction. The stones, where they are large, weigh hundreds of kilograms. They were moved into position by hand, by groups of people working together, presumably with the use of levers and rollers and the cooperation of many bodies. The stones were chosen for size and shape, in some cases brought from quarries kilometers away from the final site. The arrangements were laid out with precision. The lines are straight where they are meant to be straight. The circles are round where they are meant to be round. The alignments where they exist are accurate. This is engineering in a quiet sense. It is the engineering of ceremonial space rather than the engineering of buildings or roads, but it is engineering nonetheless. It requires planning. It requires the coordinated effort of multiple people across multiple days. It requires a community organized enough to undertake the work and to maintain it across generations. The textbook description of the first peoples of this continent, the one that says they were small mobile bands to disperse to undertake collective construction, does not account for the stone arrangements. The stone arrangements are collective construction. They are evidence of larger gatherings of shared purpose, of cultural projects that took more than one lifetime to complete. Some of the arrangements are very old, others are more recent. Some are still being used in ceremonies that the custodians do not discuss with outsiders. Others have been disused for centuries and stand silent in the bush, the stones in place, the meaning lost. The question of what they were for, in the cases where we do not know, is one of those questions that the country answers in its own time, if it answers at all. Some of them are calendars, almost certainly. Some of them are ceremonial dance grounds. Some of them are training spaces for initiation. Some of them are maps in the sense that they encode information about country, about routes, about important places. Some of them are all of these things at once, and some of them are things we do not have categories for. The thing they are not, in any case, is the work of a population too sparse to organize itself. They are the work of a population that, in those places at those times, was numerous, was settled, was coordinated, and was thinking carefully about the relationship between the ground under its feet and the sky above its head. The stones are still in place in most cases. The patterns are still visible in most cases. If you stand inside one of these arrangements on a quiet morning with no one else around, you can feel in a way that is hard to describe that you are inside a thought. Someone, a long time ago, arranged these stones in this shape because they meant something, and the meaning is partly still there, even if the words for it have been lost. The country preserves the shape. The shape preserves the trace of the meaning. The trace of the meaning is something you can almost catch if you're quiet enough and willing to look. Number 24, the dating gap, the caves that come back wrong. Across this continent, there are caves and rock shelters that have been excavated by professional archaeologists with proper stratigraphic control, with samples sent to multiple laboratories, with results published in peer-reviewed journals, and that have nonetheless returned dates that the official story has had difficulty fitting into the agreed framework. Devil's Lair, a cave in the southwest of Western Australia, was first excavated in the 1970s, with later seasons of work continuing into the 2000s. The cave contains stratified human occupation layers running back by the most recent dating to around 50,000 years before the present. Lake Mungo, as we have discussed, returns dates that push the Australian human story to at least 42,000 years, and possibly significantly older. Majid Bebe, also discussed, pushes the bottom date to 65,000. Warraty, a rock shelter in South Australia in the northern Flinders Ranges, was excavated more recently, and the bottom layers were dated to around 49,000 years before the present. The Warraty shelter contains evidence of human occupation from that date forward, including the use of red ochre, the use of gypsum, the use of groundstone tools, and the apparent association of human occupation with the bones of megafauna species. Several other sites across the continent have returned dates in the same general range, with the oldest reliable dates now clustering somewhere between 50,000 and 65,000 years before the present, depending on which dating method is preferred and which site is being considered. This is, on its own, a remarkable fact. It means that humans have been continuously present on this continent for around 60,000 years, give or take. It makes the Aboriginal occupation of this country one of the longest continuous occupations by a single ancestral population of any inhabited region on Earth. But there are dates from this continent that are not in the consensus range, dates that have been returned by careful work, but that have not been broadly accepted, because if they are correct, they would push the Australian human story significantly further back than the rest of the framework can currently support. There is a site called Jinmium in the north of the country, where preliminary thermoluminescence dating in the mid-1990s returned ages of up to 176,000 years for the lowest occupation layers. The Jinmium dates were later revised downward after additional work suggested that some of the sediments may have been disturbed, and that the thermoluminescence technique used was producing inflated ages. The currently accepted dates for Jinmium are in the range of 10,000 to 22,000 years, depending on the layer. But the original results before the revisions suggested something much older, and the revisions, while supported by careful argument, are not universally accepted by every researcher who has looked at the data. There are other sites where similar things have happened. Dates have been returned that initially looked very old. Subsequent work has either confirmed them, in which case the official story has been adjusted slightly to accommodate, or revised them downward, in which case the older numbers have been quietly retired from the literature. The pattern, viewed across the whole continent, is interesting. The trend over the past 50 years has been steadily toward older dates. The dates accepted in the 1960s put first occupation at around 20,000 years before present. The dates accepted in the 1980s put it at around 40,000. The dates accepted today put it at around 65,000. The trend has not stopped. Each generation of new dating techniques and new excavations has tended to push the number back, not forward. There is no particular reason to think that this trend has now ended. It is possible, in other words, that the bottom date for human presence on this continent is still going to move. It is possible that there are sites somewhere on the continent, perhaps still buried, perhaps still under the sea on the drowned continental shelf, perhaps in a cave that nobody has thought to enter, that would return dates significantly older than the current 65,000-year ceiling. It is possible that we have not yet found the beginning of the story. It is possible that we will not find it. And it is possible that the beginning is so far back that the framework currently in use, the one that has humans leaving Africa around 70,000 years ago and reaching Australia very quickly after that, will need to be reconsidered. The official story has shown repeatedly that it can absorb a date being pushed back by 10 or 20,000 years without falling apart entirely. It is less clear how the official story would absorb a date being pushed back by 50 or 100,000 years. We may find out, we may not. The country is patient about these things. It has the dates in its rocks and its sediments and its bone fragments. It releases them when it does in its own time. We collect them, we argue about them, we move on. And the question of when the first foot was set down on this red and quiet country remains for the moment open. The number we have today is 65,000. The number we will have in another 50 years may be different. The country is not telling us yet which way it will go. Number 25, the Toba survival. The bottleneck that should have erased the population. About 74,000 years ago, on what is now the island of Sumatra in modern Indonesia, a volcano erupted. The volcano was called Toba, and the eruption is, by most reasonable measurements, the largest volcanic event of the past 2 million years. The eruption ejected somewhere between 2 and 3,000 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. The ash blanketed much of South Asia, in some places to depths of 15 centimeters. The sulfur and aerosols thrown into the stratosphere triggered a volcanic winter, with global temperatures dropping by several degrees for years, possibly decades. The eruption coincides with a sharp narrowing in the genetic diversity of the modern human population, what geneticists call the Toba bottleneck, which suggests that the global human population at the time may have been reduced to a few thousand individuals scattered across what was then a much harsher world. The bottleneck has been disputed in detail, and some recent work suggests that humans elsewhere in the world fared better than the most pessimistic readings of the original genetic data implied. But the basic fact of the eruption and the basic fact of its severity are not in dispute. Now, here is what does not fit. The eruption of Toba happened approximately 74,000 years ago. The oldest accepted human occupation dates on this continent are around 65,000 years ago. The two events are not far apart. Whatever the relationship between them, the people who arrived on this continent did so in a world that had only recently been shaken to its foundations by one of the largest natural disasters in the entire span of human existence. They arrived in a world where, in the regions they had passed through to get here, ash was still in the soil, the climate was still recovering. The populations they had left behind were still rebuilding. They came across the water in numbers sufficient to establish a viable founding population on a new continent, in the immediate aftermath of an event that had reduced the human species globally to a handful of survivors. This is, in its way, an astonishing fact. It means that the first peoples of this country are descended from one of the small surviving populations that came through the Toba bottleneck. It means that their journey across South Asia, across the Sunda Shelf, across the open water of what would become Wallacea, and onto the landmass of Sahul took place under climatic conditions that we would now consider extraordinary, and during a recovery period for a species that had nearly not made it. It means that their tenacity was, by definition, exceptional. Most of the populations that survived the bottleneck stayed where they were. The ones who came here moved. They moved a long way. They moved in difficult conditions. They crossed water that nobody had crossed before. And when they arrived, they did not stop. They walked the length of the new continent from north to south, from coast to coast, within probably a few thousand years of first landfall. They populated the entire landmass in every climate zone, from the tropical north to the temperate south to the deserts in the center to the alpine regions of Tasmania, faster than any other population we know of has populated any other comparable area. They did this in the aftermath of a global catastrophe. They did this in conditions that the global climate record describes as some of the harshest of the entire human story. They did this without riding, without metal, without domesticated animals, without agriculture. They did this on foot with what they could carry, with the knowledge in their heads and the songs in their mouths. The textbook does not always pause to register what this means. It records the dates, it records the arrival, it moves on. But the arrival was an achievement. The arrival was, in many ways, a miracle of a kind that we no longer have a word for. The people who walked into this country 65,000 years ago, give or take, came through a doorway that had nearly closed. They closed it behind them. And what they made in the long, quiet millennia that followed was a continuous culture that lasted through every subsequent climatic upheaval the planet threw at them, through the last glacial maximum 20,000 years ago, through the post-glacial sea level rise, through the desertification of the center, through the drying of the Lake Eyre Basin, through everything, they did not break. The cultures of other continents broke, repeatedly, under climatic stress. Civilizations rose and fell in Mesopotamia, in the Indus Valley, in Central America, in China, in Europe. Whole population groups disappeared. The Aboriginal Australian population did not disappear. They adjusted. They moved with the country. They held the songs through every disruption. They came out the other side, the same people, speaking related languages, walking the same song lines that their ancestors had walked. Until the 18th century, which is when the story changes. But it changes only at the surface. Underneath, the long continuity is still there. The deep culture is still there. The country is still there. And the survival, the long, quiet, impossible survival, is something that nobody has yet really written down properly, because the words have not yet been invented for what it actually was. Number 26. The places that should not have been settled. There are parts of this continent where, by every reasonable measure, no human population should have been able to establish itself. The Western Desert in the center of the country is one of the driest inhabited regions on the planet. Annual rainfall in some parts of it averages less than 100 millimeters. The summer temperatures regularly exceed 45 degrees. There is no permanent surface water across vast areas. There are no trees large enough to provide reliable shade. There are no fixed sources of food. The vegetation is sparse, the soil is poor, and the wind is constant. And yet, the Western Desert has been continuously inhabited by Aboriginal peoples for at least 30,000 years. Possibly longer. The peoples of the Western Desert, the Pichanchachara, the Yankunichachara, the Nganyachara, the Anangu, and many others, developed a way of life so finely tuned to the conditions of that country that they were able to support a continuous population across territory that no other human group has ever permanently inhabited at comparable population densities. They did this with no agriculture, no domesticated animals other than the dingo, no metalworking, no permanent shelters, no stored water in the modern sense. They did it with knowledge. They did it with detailed, precise, multi-generational knowledge of where the water sources were in country that you would walk straight past without noticing. They did it with knowledge of where the seed-bearing plants grew, of when they fruited, of how to process the seeds into edible flour. They did it with knowledge of which animals could be hunted in which season, of which were too lean to bother with at certain times of the year, of which would lead the hunter to water if followed at the right hour of the day. They did it with knowledge of the weather, of the timing of storms across hundreds of kilometers, of when to move and when to stay, of which routes were safe in which year. And they did it with the social organization needed to maintain that knowledge across generations. The kinship systems of the Western Desert peoples are among the most complex in the human ethnographic record. Every person has a precise position in a network of relationships that determines who they can marry, who they can speak to, who they share food with, who they teach, who they are taught by. The system is not arbitrary. It is, at root, a survival mechanism. In a country where the wrong move could kill you, where the right knowledge in the right person's head could be the difference between a population surviving or vanishing, the kinship system ensures that the knowledge is distributed correctly, that the right teachers reach the right learners, that no critical piece of information is allowed to disappear because the person who knew it died before passing it on. The Western Desert peoples are one example. They are not the only one. The peoples of Tasmania, who were isolated from the mainland after the post-glacial sea level rise, survived in conditions that were extremely cold by Australian standards, with no domesticated animals, no agriculture, no contact with any other human population for at least 8,000 years. They survived. They developed their own tools, their own languages, their own ceremonial traditions. The peoples of the Cape York Peninsula in tropical North Queensland lived in close coexistence with crocodiles, with venomous snakes, with diseases that no preventive medicine could have addressed, in country that swung between wet season floods and dry season drought. They survived. They developed their own complex maritime cultures, trading with the peoples of the Torres Strait Islands and through them with the peoples of New Guinea, exchanging shells and stones and stories across the strait. The pattern, repeated across the continent, is that wherever the country was most difficult, the Aboriginal peoples of that country adapted most precisely. The deserts produced people who knew the deserts. The forests produced people who knew the forests. The cold mountains of Tasmania produced people who knew how to survive in conditions that the inhabitants of mainland Australia would have found unlivable. And in every case, the survival was based on knowledge, on social organization, on the careful transmission of information from one generation to the next, over time spans that no other human population has matched in the same kind of conditions. The textbook description of the first peoples of this continent as primitive, as undeveloped, as occupying a lower rung of some imagined human ladder, is one of the most thoroughly wrong descriptions ever written in any human document. They were the opposite of primitive. They were highly developed. They were developed for the specific conditions of the specific country they lived in. The fact that they were not developed for the conditions of European agriculture is irrelevant. The conditions of European agriculture are not what this country offers. The country offers what it offers. The people who lived here for 60,000 years figured out what the country offered, and they organized themselves around it, and they kept doing that year after year, generation after generation, in such a way that they did not break the country, and the country did not break them. There is no other human population that can say that about a piece of land they have lived on. There has never been another one. The Aboriginal peoples of this continent are, by that one measure, the most successful, long-term, sustainable human civilization that has ever existed on this planet. The textbook does not usually phrase it that way, but that is what the evidence shows. Number 27. The trade routes. The continent that traded with itself. The official story used to say that the first peoples of this country did not trade. They were too dispersed, they were too tribal, they were too inward-looking. They moved within their own country and they had little to do with the country next door. This description, like so many in the official story, turned out to be exactly opposite of the truth. The Aboriginal peoples of this continent operated for tens of thousands of years, one of the most extensive overland trade networks on the planet. The networks moved physical goods. Ochre from the famous mines at Wilgimia in the Weld Range of Western Australia was traded eastward for thousands of kilometres, reaching ceremonial sites in Central Australia, in South Australia, in Western New South Wales, in Southern Queensland. Pituri, the chewing tobacco made from the leaves of the Duboisia hopwoody plant, was traded out from its source areas in southwest Queensland across enormous distances, reaching peoples who had never seen the plant grow. Shells from the northern coasts, particularly the pearly shells of the Indian Ocean, were carried inland through trade networks that reached the central deserts and beyond. Stone axe heads from the famous quarry at Mount William in Victoria, where the rock had exactly the right properties for working, were traded across southeastern Australia, sometimes appearing in archaeological sites 1,000 kilometres from the quarry. Spinifex resin, used as adhesive for hafting tools, was traded out from the central deserts to peoples who lived where spinifex did not grow. Boomerangs, spear points, grindstones, fiber bags, ceremonial objects of all kinds move through the network from producer to user across distances that would have taken weeks or months to walk. The network was not casual, it was structured. There were established trade routes known to the people who used them, marked by sacred sites and resting places and water holes. There were trade fairs, periodic gatherings at agreed locations, where people from many language groups came together to exchange goods, settle disputes, conduct ceremonies, arrange marriages. Some of these gatherings happened annually, some happened at intervals of several years. Some were associated with the flowering of particular plants, with the migration of particular animals, with the position of particular stars. The Bogong moth gatherings of the Australian Alps brought together peoples from the Ngarigo, the Walgalu, the Jait Matang, the Ngunnawal, and many others every summer, to feast on the moths that congregated in the high country in their billions, and to conduct the ceremonies and trade that the gatherings made possible. The Bunya gatherings in the Bunya Mountains of southeast Queensland brought together peoples from across that region every 3 years, when the bunya pines produce their large, nutritious nuts in unusual abundance. The gatherings could last for weeks. People came from as far as 400 kilometers away, bringing their own goods to trade, their own ceremonies to share, their own stories to tell. The economy of the continent, in other words, was not a collection of isolated subsistence economies. It was a single integrated network connected by trade, ritual, marriage, and shared ceremonial life, operating across an area of more than 7 million square kilometers. Goods moved within it, information moved within it, people moved within it. The genetic data, when it became sophisticated enough to detect such things, confirmed that gene flow between distant populations of the continent was steady and ongoing for the entire span of the pre-colonial period. People from the center married people from the south. People from the west married people from the east. The country was not divided into closed tribal groups, the way the colonial imagination wanted to imagine it. The country was a single great network, with local nodes that were strong and distinct, but with connections between the nodes that were also strong and constant. None of this fits the colonial story. None of this fits the textbook story. The colonial story needed the Aboriginal peoples of this continent to be primitive, isolated, and unsophisticated, because that story justified what the colonial society wanted to do to them. The deeper reality, the one preserved in the trade goods that show up in the archaeological record hundreds of kilometers from their source, the one preserved in the oral histories of the trade routes that the elders still remember, the one preserved in the linguistic data that shows long-term contact between distant languages, is a reality of a sophisticated, connected, mobile population that was conducting continent-scale commerce for tens of thousands of years before anyone else on Earth had figured out how to do it across comparable distances on land. The wheel had not been invented here. The horse had not been domesticated here. There were no roads in the European sense. There were songs instead. There were paths instead. There were ceremonial obligations instead. And these were enough. They moved more goods across more distance for longer than most other pre-modern overland trade networks in the world. The country was not empty. The country was busy. It is still busy in many places, in ways that the dominant culture has not entirely noticed. The old trade routes are still there. Some of them are roads now. Some of them are highways. Some of them follow the path of railway lines that were built along stock routes that were laid out on top of older Aboriginal trails that had been there for 40,000 years. The continuity is hidden in many cases, but it is still there. The country has always been connected to itself. The country still is. Number 28, the story of the giants in the older country. There is a category of Aboriginal oral history that talks about the very earliest times, the deep times, the times before the country looked the way it looks now. These stories are not, in most cases, about ordinary human ancestors. They are about beings of a different scale, the creator ancestors of the dreaming, the figures who walked across the country and shaped it. The rainbow serpent who carved out the river valleys with the weight of her body as she moved. The Wangina who came from the sky and made the people. The Waggle, the great water snake of the southwest who shaped the rivers and the lakes. The Tidalik frog, who drank up all the water and had to be made to give it back. Biame, the all-father of much of southeastern Australia, who threw his net across the Barwon River and showed the people how to set the stones at Brewarina. The lightning brothers of the Waterman country, who fought their great battle in the sky and whose images are painted on cliff walls in country that they made. These figures are not in the ordinary sense human. They are larger, they are older, they predate the human population. They are responsible for the existence of the human population. The standard anthropological reading of these stories is that they are mythology, that they are the same kind of creation narrative that every human culture produces, sorting the world into categories of how the rivers were made, how the people came to be, how the rules of life were given. There is something to that reading. The stories do indeed perform those functions. But the stories on this continent have a peculiar property that not all creation stories have. They are tied to specific places. The Waggle made this particular river bend here in this valley, and you can see where his body lay. The Lightning Brothers fought in this particular canyon, and you can see the marks of their weapons on the walls. Bayami walked from here to here, and at each stop he did this particular thing, and the country shows the evidence of his passing. The mythology, in other words, is a topographical mythology. It is not abstract. It is not floating somewhere in a sky world disconnected from the ground. It is on the ground. It is tied to the ground. It is the story of the ground itself. And what the stories say in many cases is that the country was once different, that there were beings who walked here who were not like us, that the rivers ran differently, that the lakes were larger, that the country was wetter, that there were animals here that nobody has seen. The geology, in many cases, agrees. The country was wetter in some periods. The lakes were larger. The Lake Eyre Basin was once a system of permanent freshwater lakes the size of small seas. There were animals here that have since gone extinct. The diprotodons, the giant kangaroos, the marsupial lions. The stories about giants who walked the country may be, in some cases, stories about a country that contained, alongside the people, animals that were giants by any reasonable measure. The diprotodon was the size of a rhinoceros. The procoptodon Goliath was the size of a large draft horse. To a human encountering them, they would have been giants. They were giants. The stories may be remembering them. The stories may be remembering also the older shape of the country itself, the wetter country, the larger lakes, the forests that grew where deserts now lie. The bones in the Lake Eyre Basin tell that story. The pollen in the lake sediments tells that story. The deep sediments of the Central Australian basins, which go back through hundreds of thousands of years of climate cycles, show that the country has been a very different place in the past, alternately wetter and drier, greener and more barren, sometimes by margins that would astonish anyone familiar only with its current dry face. The stories about the older country, about the time when the giants walked, about the time when the rivers ran where the rivers now do not run, may be in some cases accurate accounts of conditions that existed many tens of thousands of years ago, preserved in the form of story because the storytellers had no other technology for preserving them. The fossil record agrees, the sediment record agrees, the oral histories of the local peoples agree. The textbook is sometimes slow to catch up, but the catching up has begun. The story of giants in the older country is, in many cases, not myth, it is memory. It is memory of a kind that we have only recently begun to take seriously, and that we are still in the early stages of learning to listen to properly. The country remembers, the stories remember. We are only now beginning to remember that we are allowed to remember too. Number 29. The contact that came and went. There is a chapter of pre-colonial contact history on the northern coasts of this continent that the standard story does discuss briefly, but that does not always get the attention it deserves. The Macassan contact. Beginning at least 400 years ago, possibly earlier, sailors from the port of Makassar on the island of Sulawesi in what is now Indonesia began making annual voyages to the northern coasts of Australia. They came in fleets of wooden boats called praus, sometimes 30 or 40 boats at a time, carrying crews of dozens of men each. They came for trepang, the dried sea cucumber, which was a valuable commodity in the Chinese trade, and which grew abundantly in the warm, shallow waters of the Arafura and Timor Seas. They would arrive in the early months of the wet season, set up camps along the coast, collect and process the trepang over a period of several months, and then return north with the monsoon winds. The pattern continued year after year for at least 2 centuries before the British arrival. Some estimates put the duration at much longer. There are sites along the northern coast that contain Macassan archaeological evidence dating back to the early 1600s and possibly earlier. There are Macassan loanwords in many northern Aboriginal languages. There are Aboriginal songs and dances that remember the Macassan visitors, in some cases very specifically, naming particular sailors, particular boats, particular events. There are Aboriginal people on the north coast whose ancestors travelled back with the Macassans, lived for periods in Macassar, and returned to Australia on later voyages. The trade was reciprocal in the sense that the Macassans brought goods to exchange, including metal tools, glass, cloth, tobacco, and rice, and the Aboriginal peoples helped to harvest and process the trepang in exchange. The relationship was, by most accounts, generally peaceful, with occasional violence on both sides, but with a long-term pattern of cooperation and mutual benefit. The British, when they arrived in the early 1800s, eventually shut the Macassan trade down. The last legal Macassan voyages occurred in 1906 and 1907, after which the British colonial administration prohibited foreign vessels from collecting trepang in Australian waters. The trade ended, the annual visits stopped, the relationships fell into disuse, but the memory remained. And the memory is important because it shows something that the official story has had trouble fully integrating. The Aboriginal peoples of this continent were not, in the period immediately before British contact, isolated. They were not unfamiliar with foreign visitors. They were not naive about international trade. They had, in the north, an established relationship with one of the major trading powers of Southeast Asia, conducted in their own waters, on their own terms, with full knowledge of the languages, customs, and material culture of their trading partners. When the British arrived, the northern Aboriginal peoples did not encounter their first foreigners. They encountered an additional set of foreigners with a different agenda, who behaved very differently from the foreigners they were used to. The Macassans had come, traded, and gone. The British came and stayed. The difference between trading and conquering is a difference that the northern peoples understood very quickly, because they had a comparison case available. This is one of the reasons that resistance to the British colonization of the North was, in many places, immediate and well organized. The northern peoples knew what trade looked like. The British were not trading. The northern peoples acted accordingly. The Macassan contact, in other words, is not a minor footnote to the Australian story. It is evidence that the Australian story has always been connected to the larger story of the Indian Ocean trading world, and that the Aboriginal peoples of this continent were participants in that world on their own terms for centuries before they had to deal with the very different kind of arrival that came from the south. The official history sometimes has trouble fitting the Macassan contact into the standard narrative because the standard narrative wants to begin in 1770 and to treat everything before that as either prehistoric or irrelevant. The Macassan contact says no. The Macassan contact says that the north coast of this country was busy with international shipping long before any European map showed the coastline in any detail. The Macassan contact says that the relevant comparison for what happened after 1770 is not with a continent of innocents meeting strangers for the first time. It is with a continent of established traders meeting a different kind of stranger, one who had a different kind of intention and who behaved in ways that the established trade had not prepared anyone for. The continent was never as cut off as the standard story sometimes implies. It was always more connected than the textbooks usually said. The Macassan boats were one of the connections. There may have been others. There almost certainly were others. The Indonesian archipelago is not far. The Indian Ocean has been crossed by boats for at least 2,000 years. The probability that no one ever drifted or sailed or rowed or paddled to the northern coast of this country during all that time, other than the documented Macassan voyages, is, on reflection, very low. The country has been connected. It has always been connected. The disconnection is something that was imposed on it later, and that is only now beginning to be undone, slowly, with effort, with intention, by the descendants of all the various people who have come, gone, returned, settled, and stayed. Number 30, the drowned country, the half of Aboriginal Australia that is now under the sea. At the height of the last glacial maximum, around 21,000 years ago, the seas around this continent were, as we have mentioned, about 120 meters lower than they are today. The exposed continental shelf was vast. The Sahel landmass, which included the modern continent of Australia, the island of New Guinea, and the island of Tasmania, was a single connected land. The total exposed area was about 30% larger than the modern continent. There were rivers running across what is now the Arafura Sea. There was a great freshwater lake in what is now the Gulf of Carpentaria. There was dry land where the Great Barrier Reef now sits. There were extensive grasslands on what is now the Bass Strait, where you could walk from the south coast of Victoria to the north coast of Tasmania without getting your feet wet. People lived in all of these places. The exposed continental shelf was not empty, it was populated. The peoples of that older country hunted, fished, built shelters, painted on rocks, raised children, conducted ceremonies, sang songs, and were buried in their own ground, just like the peoples on the parts of the continent that did not eventually flood. Then the seas rose. They rose unevenly. They rose in places at rates of more than a meter per century, which is fast enough that you would see the coastline moving inland within a single human lifetime. They rose for thousands of years. The total rise was about 120 meters, distributed over about 10,000 years, with most of the rise happening in a few accelerated phases, during which the rate would have been astonishing to anyone watching it. The people who had lived on the exposed shelf retreated. They retreated inland, generation by generation, leaving behind the country they had known, the country their ancestors had named, the country where their grandparents were buried. They retreated to a coast that was, on the day they retreated, 100 kilometers further inland than the coast their grandparents had known. They moved their stories with them. They moved their songs with them. They moved their kinship systems with them, but they could not move the country itself. The country was lost. The country is still lost. It is still under the water. The Sunda Shelf and the Sahul Shelf between them lost more land to the post-glacial sea level rise than any other part of the planet. Underneath those waters, somewhere, are the rock shelters, the campsites, the burial grounds, the fish traps, the painted caves, and possibly the stone structures of an entire half of the Aboriginal Australian story, never excavated, never photographed, never recovered, because they are under 20 to 100 meters of salt water and have been for between 7,000 and 15,000 years. Marine archaeology in this country is still in its early stages. There are some sites that have been found. There is a site off the coast of the Murujuga Peninsula in the Dampier archipelago where stone artifacts have been recovered from the seafloor at depths of around 15 meters. The artifacts are clearly human-made. The seafloor at that depth would have been dry land around 8,000 years ago. There are sites in the Gulf of Carpentaria where the seafloor preserves the traces of what appear to be old river systems and old shorelines, with the kind of geomorphic features that, on land, would attract archaeological attention immediately. There are areas of the Bass Strait that contain the remains of forests, of riverbeds, of soil profiles, of everything you would expect to find on a settled landscape, all of it now 20 to 50 meters underwater. The work of looking is just beginning. The technology to look properly is still being developed. The funding to look at scale does not yet exist, but the country is there, the drowned country. It is the largest single archaeological resource on the planet that has not yet been investigated. It contains, almost certainly, materials that would change the story of the Aboriginal occupation of this continent fundamentally. It contains, possibly, the oldest occupation sites of all, because the first peoples who arrived here 65,000 years ago came from the north, and they would have come ashore on what was then the exposed northern coast of Sahul. That coast is now under the water. The first footprint on Australia, if it were ever found, would likely be found underwater. The first campsite, the first burial, the first rock painting, the earliest tools. All of them, in all likelihood, lie under the sea, in country that was not the center at the time of its occupation, but that was the very beginning. The peoples whose ancestors walked that coast still remember in some cases that it was there. The songs that name the lost islands, the stories about country that has gone under the sea, the references in ceremony to ancestors who came across the water from a land that no longer exists. These are not metaphors. They are accounts. They are memory of a kind that is now being confirmed by marine geology and by the deep oral tradition to be referring to real places that were real homes. The country lost, the country preserved underwater, the country that the standard archaeological methods cannot yet reach. The deeper we look at Aboriginal history, the more of it turns out to be underwater, under sand, under the patient-led evidence that the continent itself has been keeping for us, in case we ever became careful enough to look properly. We are becoming slowly more careful. The drowned country is still there. It is waiting. And one day, when the right techniques and the right funding and the right protocols are all aligned, we will start to look. And what we find will almost certainly change the story again in ways that the present story cannot yet anticipate. The continent has always had more than half of itself underwater in this sense. The visible half is the one we know about. The other half, the half that fell into the sea, is the one that holds perhaps the answers to most of the questions in this list. Until we look there, the questions will remain open, and open questions in this country are not failures. They are invitations. The country is asking us to keep looking. The country has been asking us to keep looking for a very long time. So that is the list. 30 places or stories or fragments or things that the official narrative of Aboriginal Australia has had trouble fitting into the shape of itself. There is Majid Bebe, the rock shelter that pushed the timeline back by 20,000 years in a single excavation. There is Lake Mungo, where the oldest ceremonial burial known to anyone anywhere was found in the sand. There are the Gwion paintings dancing across the rock walls of the Kimberley, painted by people whose descendants nobody has identified. There are the Wandjina with their halos and their missing mouths, gazing out from cliff faces in country that has been retouching them for tens of thousands of years. There is Budj Bim with its stone houses and its eel traps, holding open the question of what counts as agriculture. There is Brewarina, where the river still runs through stone walls that may have been laid down before the first pyramid of Egypt was begun. There are the songlines, the sung map of the continent, carrying the marked routes of a long, busy population across what was supposed to be empty land. There are the stories of the rising sea, which preserve the memory of an event that ended 7,000 years ago in a form that the textbook said was impossible. There are the paintings of the megafauna, painted by people who saw or who remembered seeing the giants that walked this country. There are the footprints at Willandra, the sprinting man and the running children on a wet morning 23,000 years ago in a country we now think of as dry. There is the astronomy of the Burong and the Yolngu and the Wardaman, the sky calendars that knew when the mallee fowl would lay her eggs. There is the crater at Tunarala and the crater at Henbury, and the local memory of the events that made them. There is Cuddy Springs, where humans and megafauna shared a water hole for a length of time that the Blitzkrieg model cannot account for. There are the hairy people, the Yowie and the Yunjadi, who may be folklore and may not be. There is the hill at Gympie, terraced and disputed, that nobody has properly excavated. There is the microblade revolution, the technology shift that arrived around 5,000 years ago and changed the kit of the continent. There are the boomerangs scattered across the world in places that the official story says nobody from this country ever reached. There are the genetic signals of the second migration, the small group that arrived around 4,000 years ago and was absorbed. There is the mahogany ship, buried under the sand dunes of Victoria, last seen in the 1860s and never properly recovered. There are the lost languages, the 240 that died in a century and a half, taking with them ways of describing the country that nothing now can replace. There is Coranderk, the town that worked until it was not allowed to. There is Murujuga, the largest open air rock art gallery in the world, fading slowly under industrial emissions. There are the stone arrangements, the silent ceremonial geometries on hilltops and plains across the country. There is the dating gap, the trend that keeps pushing the bottom date back and that may not yet be finished. There is the Toba bottleneck, and the fact that the people who arrived here came through a doorway that had nearly closed. There are the places that should not have been settled, the deserts and the cold mountains and the tropical river systems, all of which were settled, all of which were lived in, all of which were turned into home by a knowledge that the textbook did not credit. There are the trade routes, the continent that traded with itself for tens of thousands of years before any wheel rolled here. There are the stories of the giants in the older country, the memories of when the rivers ran differently and the lakes were larger. There is the Macassan contact, the trade with Southeast Asia that ran for centuries before the British arrived. And there is the drowned country, the lost half of this story, lying patient under the water of the continental shelf, waiting for techniques and intentions that we have not yet quite developed. 30 stories, 30 pieces, 30 fragments of a deeper, older, much stranger picture than the one the school books have told. You will notice, perhaps, that the official story has appeared in this list more as a backdrop than as a hero. The official story said one thing. The country, in case after case, said another. The official story said the first peoples were nomadic. The country showed houses, fish traps, ceremonial structures, and aquaculture. The official story said they were primitive. The country showed astronomy, kinship systems, intercontinental trade, and the longest continuous cultural tradition on Earth. The official story said they had no real history. The country showed a history so deep that we are still finding its lowest layers, and the lowest layers we have found are still not the bottom. The deeper we look at Aboriginal history, the less sense the official story makes. And the more we listen to what the country and the elders and the songs and the rock walls and the sediment cores and the genetic data and the oral traditions are all quietly saying, the more sense the deeper story makes, the one that has been waiting under the surface all along for someone to notice that it is there. It is not a single story. It is many stories, layered, interleaved, sometimes contradictory, sometimes mutually reinforcing. All of them held together by the country itself, which has been the continuous keeper of all of them through every disruption of human memory that has ever happened on these shores. The country is still keeping them. The country will continue to keep them. And we, slowly, with effort, are beginning to ask the country the right questions. We are not always getting the answers right. We are not always asking in the right way, but we are getting better. Younger generations of researchers are working in close partnership with traditional custodians. Older theories are being set aside. New techniques are being applied. The conversation is slowly becoming the kind of conversation it should always have been between people who know the country in different ways, but who are all trying to understand the same country. None of this means that we have it all figured out. We do not. We have, if anything, more open questions now than we had 50 years ago. Each new discovery seems to deepen the puzzle rather than to solve it. Each new date pushes back the timeline. Each new genetic study reveals a connection we had not suspected. Each new excavation turns up something that does not quite fit the previous framework. The deeper we look, the less sense it makes. The more open the questions become, the more obvious it becomes that the official story we were given was a sketch, not a portrait, and that the portrait, when we finally see it, will be both much older and much more complex than the sketch ever allowed for. None of this is reason for alarm. It is reason for patience. It is reason for the kind of long, quiet attention that the country itself has always practiced. The country does not rush. The country is not in a hurry to give up its secrets. The country has a great many secrets, and it releases them slowly in its own time to those who are willing to wait. The first peoples of this country have known how to wait for a very long time. They have been waiting in many cases for the rest of us to be ready to listen. Some of us are starting to be ready. Most of us are not yet. But the country is patient. The country has all the time in the world. And the story, the deeper story, the older story, the story that does not make sense by the official rules and that makes a different kind of sense by its own, is still there, still being told, still being passed on in songs and ceremonies and quiet conversations between elders and the next generation, still being held by the continent itself in its red dust and its quiet caves and its painted walls and its drowned country and its patient rocks. Tonight, we have walked through 30 fragments of that story. Tomorrow night, or some night soon, there will be more fragments to look at because the story is much longer than 30 fragments. The story is endless. The story is the country. And the country is still here. The lights are low, the room is quiet, the voice that has been speaking will soon be quiet too. There is nothing more tonight that needs to be wondered about. There is nothing more tonight that needs to be understood. The understanding's allowed to come later, when the morning is here and the day is offering itself for whatever the day is going to offer. For now, let the wondering settle. Let the questions rest where they have been raised. Let the country keep what the country keeps. And let yourself slowly, gently fall into the kind of sleep that comes when a long story has been told and the storyteller has, at last, run out of things to say. If you're still awake, that is perfectly all right. Some nights take longer than others. Some stories settle slowly. Some of the questions raised tonight may be the kind that move around in the back of your mind for a while, looking for somewhere to lie down, the way a tired animal sometimes circles a clearing 2 or 3 times before finally lowering itself onto the grass. Let them circle. Let them find their place. They will eventually settle. They will eventually rest. And while they are still moving, let me say 1 or 2 more quiet things, because sometimes the small additions at the end of a long talk are the things that help the listener finally let go. One thing I would like to say is that nothing in tonight's list is hidden in any meaningful sense. The Madjed Bebe excavation reports are public. The dating papers from Lake Mungo are in the scientific journals. The Guion paintings are visible to anyone who travels into the Kimberley with the right permissions. The Wandjina figures are on the tourist routes, at least the ones the custodians have chosen to make accessible. The Budge Bim site is on the World Heritage List. The Brewerina fish traps are in a publicly accessible reserve, with interpretive signs explaining what the visitor is looking at. The songlines are documented in dozens of scholarly books and in many beautiful documentaries. The footprints at Willandra have been written about extensively. The astronomy of the Burong and the Yolngu is taught at universities. The Tunarala crater is a national park. The Coranderrok story is preserved in the archives of the Public Record Office of Victoria. The Murujuga rock art is the subject of ongoing public campaigns to protect it from industrial damage. The Mackensen contact is described in school curricula in the Northern Territory. Everything we have walked through tonight is, in principle, available to anyone who wants to look. The strangeness is not that the information is hidden. The strangeness is that we have collectively decided not to look at it together as a single body of evidence. We have looked at it in fragments. We have parceled out the fragments to different specialist literatures, to different academic disciplines, to different cultural institutions. The archaeologists know the dating sites. The linguists know the language extinctions. The art historians know the rock galleries. The geneticists know the migration patterns. The anthropologists know the kinship systems. The historians know Korondek and the Macassan trade. The astronomers know the sky calendars. Each of these specialists knows their own part. Few of them know all the parts. Almost nobody, except a handful of synthesizing thinkers who have spent decades on this material, has put all the pieces together in one place and asked the simple question of what they collectively imply. The simple question, when you ask it, has a simple answer. They collectively imply that the first peoples of this continent maintained a continuous, sophisticated, complexly organized civilization across this entire landmass for at least 65,000 years. They had architecture where it suited them. They had aquaculture where it suited them. They had intercontinental trade. They had astronomical knowledge. They had ceremonial geometry. They had long-distance communication networks. They had a literature in the form of song and story that preserved accurate eyewitness accounts of events going back tens of thousands of years. They had medicine, navigation, agriculture by another name, manufacturing, kinship law, dispute resolution, and a relationship with their country so finely calibrated that they were able to live in places where no other human population has ever sustained itself at comparable density. They were a civilization. They were the longest lasting civilization in the human record. They are still here. Their descendants are walking the streets of every city in this country tonight. The civilization did not end. It was disrupted. It is now in a long period of recovery and reassertion, with the deep knowledge being brought back into the public conversation by elders, by language teachers, by archaeological collaborators, by the custodians of country who are doing the slow work of reconnecting the threads that were cut in the colonial period. None of this is hidden. None of this is forbidden knowledge. None of this requires special permission to encounter, though some of the specific stories do require permission from the relevant custodians before being shared. And the appropriate way to ask for that permission is to ask directly, with patience, and with the willingness to be told no. What is striking is how rarely we, as a broader society, have arranged the encounters that would let us see all of this together. The textbook stops short. The documentary moves too fast. The news cycle treats each new discovery as a single isolated headline. The synthesis happens only in the books that few people read and in the conversations that few people are invited to. The synthesis is what we have tried in our small way tonight to do. We have stood quietly with 30 fragments in turn, and we have noticed that they keep pointing in the same direction. They keep pointing to a deeper country, an older country, a more populated and more sophisticated country than the country the standard story has described. The pointing is consistent. The pointing is not a coincidence. 30 fragments do not all point the same way by accident. The pointing is the truth, gradually emerging through the cracks in the official sketch. So, another thing I would like to say is that this is a hopeful story, even though it contains losses. The genocides of the colonial period, the language deaths, the dispersal of communities, the destruction of sacred sites, the slow erosion of country by mining and industry and ongoing settlement are real losses. They are not minor. They will not be undone. But the deeper story they have not been able to erase. The country has held it through worse. The country has held it through climate shifts and sea level rises and volcanic catastrophes and migrations and the long, slow turn of geological time. The country is good at holding things. The country is patient. The country does not need to be reminded of what it has held. The country knows. And the people whose ancestors lived here for 65,000 years know too. They are still here. They are still walking the country. They are still teaching the songs to children where the teaching has been able to continue. They are still doing the ceremonies where the ceremonies have been able to continue. They are still answering the country's questions in the country's language, in the country's time. And the rest of us are slowly learning to ask quieter questions of our own and to wait for the country and for the people of the country to answer in their own way. The conversation has only just begun. The deeper book has only just been opened. The chapters we have looked at tonight are early chapters. There are many more to come. Some of them will be found in caves we have not yet entered. Some of them will be found under the water we cannot yet see clearly through. Some of them will be told to us by elders we have not yet met when we have finally learned how to listen properly. Some of them will simply unfold the way the country unfolds, when the right person walks past it on the right morning and notices what the rest of us walked straight past. There is no rush. There has never been a rush in this country. The country itself is 65,000 years older in human terms than any other inhabited country on Earth, and it is more patient than we are. We can afford to take our time. We are allowed to take our time. The story will be there when we get to it. It has been there all along. It is still there now. It will still be there tomorrow night. And the night after that, and the night after that, when this voice is gone and another voice is speaking, or when no voice is speaking at all, when only the wind is moving across the red ground in the slow way that the wind on this continent has been moving for as long as there has been wind. The country does not need us to finish the story tonight. The country only needs us to know that the story is real, that the story is older than we were told, that the story is deeper than we were told, that the story is still being kept by hands and voices and rocks and ground and water on every part of this continent we have ever walked across and every part we have not yet learned to walk across properly. The story is in good keeping. It always has been. So now, finally, let the voice quiet down. Let the lamp by your bed, if there is one, grow soft. Let the small sounds of the room around you become familiar. Let your body settle into whatever shape your body wants to settle into for the night. There are no more places to walk through. There are no more questions to raise. There is only the quiet and the dark and the long, deep continuity of a country that has been here for a long time and will be here long after this night is over. Rest in the keeping of that continuity. Sleep in its long, patient holding. The country has you tonight. The country has always had you in a way, even if you did not know it. The country has been the floor under every step you have taken since you arrived here, whenever it was that you arrived, whether you were born into it or whether you came to it later. The country does not care which. The country only cares that you are here now, in this moment, listening to a long, quiet story about all the things the country has been keeping in its long, quiet patience. The country is glad you have listened tonight. The country, in its own way, is grateful. And the country, like the deeper story, is not going anywhere. Good night.